Desperation wears many faces, but poverty wears only one, the hollow-eyed spectre of a future slipping through trembling fingers. England, 1823. The weak afternoon light filtered through the grimy window of the lodging house on Cheapside, casting pale shadows across the threadbare carpet, and the solitary figure bent over a scarred wooden table. Catherine Fairmont, 27 years old and daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont, counted the remaining coins in her purse for the third time that hour, as though repetition might somehow multiply their meagre sum. It did not. Her fingers, once soft and uncalloused, now bore the telltale marks of a gentlewoman fallen on desperate times. The black morning dress she wore had faded to a dingy charcoal, its hem frayed from 3 years of constant use. Her dark brown hair, thick and lustrous despite her circumstances, was pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. No servant attended her. No maid brought tea or tended the small fire struggling against the October chill. On the table before her lay a collection that told the story of her decline more eloquently than any words might. A stack of letters, their wax seals broken, their contents increasingly threatening. The most recent, received that very morning, bore the stern letterhead of Bramwell and Sons, solicitors, and concluded with language that made Catherine's stomach clench with familiar dread. Final notice before legal proceedings commence. Debtor's prison awaits those who refuse to honour their obligations. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her grim contemplation. Catherine rose, smoothing the front of her dress in a gesture that was equal parts habit and futile dignity. "Miss Fairmont," came the clipped voice of Mrs. Dawson, the lodging-house proprietress. "A word, if you please." Catherine opened the door to find the older woman's expression set in lines of practiced displeasure. At 50, Mrs. Dawson had the hardened countenance of one who had seen too many lodgers promise payment they could not deliver. "The rent is 3 weeks overdue," Mrs. Dawson stated without preamble. "I've been patient, given your circumstances, but patience doesn't pay the coal merchant or the butcher." "I understand, Mrs. Dawson," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "You're expecting a miracle, Miss Fairmont, same as last week and the week before." The woman's expression softened fractionally. "I'm not without sympathy for your situation, but I run a business, not a charity. 3 days. If payment isn't forthcoming by then, I'll have to let the room to someone who can pay." Catherine nodded, the words of protest dying on her lips. What could she say? That her father's debts had consumed the last remnants of her inheritance. That she had sold her mother's pearl brooch, her father's pocket watch, every item of value she possessed, and still the creditors circled like carrion birds. 3 days, she agreed quietly. "I understand." Mrs. Dawson departed with a rustle of stiff skirts, leaving Catherine alone with her inadequate pile of coins and the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. She returned to the table, her gaze falling on the letters once more. £18, 7 shillings, and 3p. That was all that stood between her and complete destitution. The rent alone was £2 per week. A commotion in the street below drew her attention to the window. A messenger boy, his livery cleaner and finer than anything Catherine had worn in years, was inquiring with Mrs. Dawson at the doorstep. The proprietress pointed upward, and Catherine watched with growing apprehension as the boy disappeared from view. Moments later, another knock. "Letter for Miss Catherine Fairmont," the boy announced when she opened the door, extending a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper. "From the offices of Greaves and Associates, solicitors. I'm to wait for a reply regarding attendance." Catherine accepted the letter with fingers that trembled slightly. The seal bore an unfamiliar crest, and the paper quality spoke of wealth far beyond her current sphere. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet within. The message was brief and formal. Mr. Tobias Greaves requested the honour of Miss Fairmont's presence at his offices in Gray's Inn at 4 o'clock that very afternoon. A matter of some delicacy required immediate discussion. A carriage would be provided if she sent word of her acceptance. Catherine glanced at the small clock on the mantel. 3:30. "Please inform Mr. Greaves that I shall attend," she told the messenger, her mind already racing through possibilities. Another creditor. some final legal proceeding regarding her father's tangled financial affairs. Or, and this seemed almost too much to hope, some unknown benefactor. The boy nodded and departed. Catherine stood motionless in the centre of her small room, the letter clutched in her hand. Then, with the practiced efficiency of necessity, she set about making herself as presentable as her limited resources allowed. 15 minutes later, a carriage far finer than any she had ridden in years pulled up before the lodging house. The driver handed her in with the courtesy due to a lady, though his eyes took in her worn dress with the quick assessment of a servant well versed in reading his betters' circumstances. The journey to Gray's Inn took them through streets Catherine had once known well, past townhouses where she had attended balls and dinners in what now seemed like another lifetime. The early evening traffic moved in fits and starts, hansoms and private carriages jostling for position, while street vendors called their wares and crossing sweepers darted between the vehicles. When the carriage finally drew up before a substantial brick building near the Inns of Court, Catherine took a steadying breath. Whatever awaited her within could hardly be worse than her current situation. A clerk ushered her through a warren of corridors lined with deed boxes and legal volumes, their leather bindings gleaming dully in the lamplight. The smell of ink, parchment, and old paper permeated everything, the scent of law and commerce and binding contracts. "Miss Fairmont," the clerk announced, opening a heavy oak door. The office beyond was spacious and well appointed, its walls lined with more books, its wide desk covered with neat stacks of documents. Behind the desk sat a man of perhaps 50 years, his iron-grey hair receding from a high forehead, his eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. But it was the other man in the room who commanded Catherine's immediate attention. He stood near the window, tall enough that he had to be well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored coat, with an authority that needed no reinforcement. His hair was black as a raven's wing, swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble for all the emotion it displayed. His eyes, when they turned to assess her, were a blue so intense they seemed almost unnatural, the colour of a winter sky before snow. This, Catherine knew with absolute certainty, was a man accustomed to power. "Miss Fairmont," the older man behind the desk rose with a courteous bow. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I am Tobias Greaves. Allow me to introduce His Grace, the Duke of Windemere." Catherine executed a curtsy appropriate to the rank, her mind reeling. A duke? What possible business could a duke have with her? "Please, be seated," Mr. Greaves gestured to a chair before the desk. The duke moved from the window, taking up a position that allowed him to observe Catherine's profile. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. "Miss Fairmont," Mr. Greaves began, folding his hands atop the desk. "We have asked you here regarding a matter of some delicacy. His Grace requires a particular service, one that demands both discretion and breeding. Your circumstances, if you'll forgive my directness, make you uniquely suited to fulfill this requirement." Catherine's throat had gone dry. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Mr. Greaves." "Then allow me to speak plainly." The Duke's voice was deep, cultured, and utterly controlled. He moved to stand beside Greaves's desk, his height and bearing dominating the room. "I require a woman to appear at my side for 30 consecutive nights. Not as a servant, not precisely as a guest, as someone whose presence suggests a potential future arrangement." Heat flooded Catherine's cheeks. "Your Grace, Before you refuse," he continued, cutting across her protest with the casual authority of one accustomed to being obeyed, "you should understand the terms. £3,000, Miss Fairmont, paid in 2 instalments. 1,500 upon acceptance, the remainder upon completion of the 30 nights. In exchange, you will attend specified social functions at my estate in Kent, present yourself as my companion, and maintain absolute discretion regarding the nature of our arrangement. £3,000. The sum echoed in Catherine's mind like cathedral bells. It was more money than she had seen in 3 years, more than enough to satisfy every creditor, to secure modest lodgings, to purchase time and breathing room and the basic dignity of solvency. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "Forgive me, Your Grace. But why me? You could have your choice of fortune hunters and social climbers. The Duke's expression remained impassive, of women who would see such an arrangement as a stepping stone to permanent attachment. I require someone who understands the transactional nature of what I'm proposing. Someone who will fulfill her obligations and then depart without complication. Mr. Greaves cleared his throat gently. His Grace's late grandmother's will contains a stipulation. By his 35th birthday, he must demonstrate clear intent to establish a family, or control of the principal estate passes to a distant cousin. His Grace turns 35 in 5 weeks. The 30 nights of social appearances, properly witnessed, will satisfy the testament's requirements. I see, Catherine said slowly, though in truth she saw far more than they perhaps intended her to see. A duke trapped by the requirements of inheritance, seeking the appearance of courtship without the reality. It was cold, calculated, and utterly pragmatic. And after the 30 nights? You will receive your final payment and return to London or wherever you choose, the Duke replied. I ask only for discretion. No claims, no expectations beyond what has been explicitly agreed upon. Catherine looked down at her hands, at the worn gloves that had been mended twice, at the fingers that had learned to write her own correspondence because she could no longer afford a secretary. 3 days until Mrs. Dawson evicted her, debtor's prison looming like a spectre. How did you find me? She asked. A slight shift in the Duke's expression might have been amusement. I made inquiries. A gentlewoman fallen on difficult times, daughter of a peer, educated and presentable, but desperate enough to accept unconventional terms. Your name appeared on several creditors' lists. The casual revelation that he had investigated her circumstances should have offended her. Instead, Catherine felt only a weary recognition of how thoroughly she had fallen from her former station. I require time to consider, she said, raising her eyes to meet the Duke's unflinching gaze. Understandable. You have until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Send word to Mr. Greaves with your decision. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Fairmont, I investigated thoroughly. Your father's debts were not of his making, but inherited from your grandfather's speculations. You sacrificed your own prospects to shield your family from complete ruin. That speaks to character I value. Then he was gone, leaving Catherine alone with Mr. Greaves and the impossible decision before her. The carriage returned her to Cheapside as twilight deepened into night. Catherine climbed the narrow stairs to her room, her mind churning with considerations both practical and moral. £3,000, 30 nights. A duke who looked at her with eyes like winter ice and offered salvation without pretense of sentiment. She lit a single candle to conserve oil and sat once more at her scarred table. The letters from creditors seemed to mock her with their dire pronouncements. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Dawson moving about in the room below, preparing the evening meal Catherine could not afford. The clock struck 9, its chime thin and reedy. 3 days until eviction. Perhaps weeks until debtor's prison, where gentlewomen shared cells with common criminals and emerged, if they emerged at all, broken in body and spirit. Or 30 nights attending balls and dinners as the companion of a duke, presenting a fiction to satisfy a legal requirement and emerging with enough money to rebuild a life. Catherine pressed her fingers to her temples, exhaustion and hunger making her thoughts swim. In the distance, church bells rang the hour, their sound carrying across the London night. Somewhere in this vast city, the Duke of Windemere sat in what was surely a comfortable study, perhaps not even thinking of the woman whose fate he had so casually offered to transform. A sharp knock at the door made her start. Mrs. Dawson again. Miss Fairmont, I forgot to mention, the coal merchant refuses further credit. The fire goes out tonight, unless you've coin for more. Catherine looked at her meagre pile of coins, at the cold fireplace, at the thin blanket on her narrow bed. I understand, Mrs. Dawson. When the proprietress had gone, Catherine moved to the window and looked out at London spreading before her in 1,000 points of lamplight. Somewhere out there, in fine houses with warm fires and full larders, people lived without the constant gnawing fear of destitution. She had been one of them once, before her father's death, before the creditors came with their demands and their threats. The Duke's proposition was unconventional. Yes, some might call it scandalous. But it was also honest in its dishonesty, clear in its terms, finite in its duration. 30 nights. Catherine watched her breath mist in the cold air and made her decision. The morning light through Mr. Greaves's office window held none of the previous day's autumn warmth. Catherine Fairmont sat across from the solicitor, her worn gloves clasped tightly in her lap. Her decision made, but no less daunting for its necessity. "I accept His Grace's proposition," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Tobias Greaves nodded, as though he had never doubted the outcome. From a locked drawer in his substantial desk, he withdrew a leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of banknotes. Catherine watched as he counted them with practiced efficiency, arranging them in neat piles. £1,500, as agreed, he stated, sliding the money across the polished wood. "His Grace has instructed me to ensure your immediate needs are addressed before departure. The remaining 1,500 will be delivered upon successful completion of the 30 nights." Catherine stared at the banknotes, more money than she had seen since her father's death. Her fingers trembled as she reached for them, half expecting the bills to vanish like morning mist. "There are certain legal documents requiring your signature," Mr. Greaves continued, producing several sheets of dense text. "Standard formalities regarding discretion and the termination of obligations after the agreed period. I trust you'll find the terms clear." Catherine read through each document with the careful attention her father had taught her. The language was precise and, as the solicitor had indicated, straightforward. She would attend 30 consecutive nights of social functions at Windemere Hall. She would present herself as the Duke's companion. She would maintain absolute discretion regarding the arrangement both during and after its conclusion. In exchange, she would receive £3,000 and be released from all obligations at the end of the specified period. She signed her name in the spaces indicated, each stroke of the pen feeling like a step across a threshold from which there could be no return. "Excellent." Mr. Greaves blotted the signatures and filed the documents away. "His Grace's carriage will collect you at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I suggest you address your most pressing financial matters before departure. Windemere Hall is approximately 4 hours' journey from London." Catherine left the offices of Greaves and Associates with the banknotes secured in her reticule, their weight somehow both reassuring and terrifying. Her first destination was the offices of Bramwell and Sons, the solicitors who had sent the most recent threatening correspondence. The clerk who had penned such dire warnings regarding debtors' prison looked considerably less imposing when Catherine laid £500 on his desk and requested a receipt for full satisfaction of her father's debt. "The entire amount?" The man blinked behind his spectacles. "Miss Fairmont, I wasn't aware, that is, we had been given to understand. You were given to understand that I was destitute and unable to pay." Catherine finished for him, accepting the hastily prepared receipt. "Circumstances changed, sir." Her next stop was the bank where her father had maintained his accounts before his death. The manager who had once refused her requests for additional time now became remarkably solicitous when she deposited £800 and requested that smaller debts be settled from the account. By the time she returned to the lodging house on Cheapside, it was past noon, and her reticule contained receipts for every major debt that had haunted her for 3 years. The remaining £200 she kept for Mrs. Dawson and incidental expenses. The proprietress opened her door at Catherine's knock, her expression already set in anticipated refusal. It shifted to surprise when Catherine handed her £6 for the overdue rent and an additional £4 for the next month. "I'll be away for approximately 5 weeks, Catherine explained. "When I return, I'll be seeking more suitable lodgings, but I'd like to keep this room available in the interim. The extra payment should cover that arrangement." Mrs. Dawson turned the coins over in her palm, as though checking for counterfeits. "Away, miss? Might I ask where?" "On a private matter," Catherine replied evenly. "I'll be travelling to Kent." The older woman's eyes narrowed with speculation, but she pocketed the money and nodded. "Very well, Miss Fairmont. The room will be here when you return." Catherine packed her few belongings in the same battered trunk that had accompanied her from her father's house 3 years earlier. Her wardrobe was embarrassingly sparse. 2 morning dresses, 3 serviceable day dresses, undergarments worn thin from repeated washing, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a miniature portrait of her parents that was her most treasured possession. At precisely 2 o'clock, the Duke's carriage arrived. The coachman loaded her trunk with the same courtesy he might have shown a duchess, and Catherine settled into cushions far more luxurious than anything she had experienced in years. As the carriage pulled away from Cheapside, Catherine pressed her palm flat against the leather seat and exhaled slowly. For the first time in 3 years, she could draw breath without the constricting terror of imminent ruin. The creditors were satisfied. Her immediate needs were secured. Whatever came next, at least she would face it from a position of temporary stability rather than desperate poverty. The journey to Kent took them through countryside that gradually transformed from London's sprawling outskirts to rolling farmland and ancient forests, just beginning to turn with autumn colour. Catherine watched through the window as estates appeared and disappeared, each grander than the last, until finally the carriage turned onto a long drive lined with copper beech trees. Windemere Hall rose before her like something from a dream, or perhaps a novel. The house was built of pale stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light, its classical proportions speaking of wealth that had endured for generations. Wings extended from the central block in perfect symmetry, and formal gardens stretched toward distant hills where sheep grazed in fields, bounded by ancient hedgerows. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, where a small delegation of servants stood assembled. At their head was a woman of perhaps 55, her grey hair arranged beneath a crisp cap, her bearing suggesting authority tempered with warmth. "Miss Fairmont," the woman curtsied. "I am Mrs. Winslow, housekeeper of Windemere Hall." "Welcome." Catherine descended from the carriage, acutely conscious of her worn dress and shabby trunk. The servants' gazes assessed her with the quick discretion of their profession, but she saw no open judgment in their faces. "Thank you, Mrs. Winslow," she replied, returning the curtsy. "I hope my arrival hasn't caused undue disruption." "Not at all, miss. His Grace has instructed that you be given the Rose Suite in the East Wing. If you'll follow me." The interior of Windemere Hall exceeded even the exterior's promise. Catherine followed Mrs. Winslow through an entrance hall floored in black and white marble, past walls hung with portraits of severe-looking ancestors, up a sweeping staircase with banisters of polished mahogany. Everything spoke of wealth maintained across generations, of privilege so deeply rooted it required no ostentation. The Rose Suite proved to be a collection of rooms that dwarfed Catherine's entire lodging-house accommodation. A sitting room decorated in shades of cream and rose opened onto a bedchamber dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with silk damask. Beyond lay a dressing room and, most astonishingly, a private bathing chamber fitted with modern plumbing. "His Grace thought you might require suitable attire," Mrs. Winslow said, gesturing to where several gowns hung in the dressing room. "A modiste from Canterbury arrived this morning with items made to the measurements His Grace provided. If the fit is not perfect, she'll return tomorrow for adjustments." Catherine moved to examine the dresses, her fingers trembling as they touched silk and fine wool. There were evening gowns, day dresses, walking costumes, even delicate undergarments of lawn and lace. Everything was tasteful, expensive, and utterly foreign to her recent experience. "The measurements," she heard herself ask. "How did His Grace obtain them?" Mrs. Winslow's expression suggested she had fielded similar questions before. "His Grace is thorough in all his undertakings, miss. I believe he consulted with a dressmaker who recalled making garments for you several years ago. The proportions were estimated from those records." It should have unsettled her, this evidence of how thoroughly the Duke had investigated her circumstances. Instead, Catherine felt only a weary recognition that privacy was another luxury she could no longer afford. "The first event is this evening," Mrs. Winslow continued. "A ball for the local gentry. Nothing overly formal, perhaps 60 guests. His Grace requests your presence in the drawing room at 7 o'clock. When the housekeeper departed, Catherine sank onto the bed and stared at her surroundings. Just this morning, she had been counting coins in a cold room, facing eviction and prison. Now she sat in luxury that would have seemed impossible mere hours ago. She thought of the phrase from the documents she had signed. "You'll be mine for 30 nights. 30 nights to play a part. 30 nights to be someone she was not, in a world she no longer belonged to. The enormity of what she had agreed to threatened to overwhelm her, but Catherine pushed the feeling aside. She had made her choice. Now she would fulfill her obligations with the same dignity she had maintained through 3 years of poverty. At 6 o'clock, a maid arrived to help her dress. The girl was perhaps 18, with careful hands and a kind face. Together, they selected an evening gown of pale blue silk, its cut modest but elegant, its quality beyond anything Catherine had worn since her father's death. The maid arranged Catherine's hair in a style that softened the sharp planes hunger had carved into her face. When Catherine finally stood before the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. The dress fit as though made specifically for her, which perhaps it had been. For the first time in years, she looked like what she had been born to be. A gentleman's daughter, educated and refined. At precisely 7 o'clock, Catherine descended the main staircase with her heart in her throat. The entrance hall below had been transformed, its chandeliers blazing with what must have been 100 candles. Music drifted from the ballroom beyond, and she could see guests beginning to arrive, their carriages forming a queue along the drive. Adrian Carlyle, Duke of Windemere, stood at the foot of the stairs, magnificent in evening dress of black and white. His eyes tracked her progress as she descended, that same winter-blue gaze she remembered from Mr. Greaves's office, assessing and utterly unreadable. "Miss Fairmont," he greeted her when she reached the bottom step, offering his arm with formal courtesy. "You look presentable." It was hardly an effusive compliment, but Catherine accepted it with equal formality. "Thank you, Your Grace. The guests tonight are neighbours and local gentry," he said as they moved toward the ballroom. "You will be introduced as a family connection visiting from London. You will dance with me twice, no more, no less. You will be pleasant, but reserved. You will give the impression of someone who might become significant in my life, but who has not yet determined if I am significant in hers. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." They entered the ballroom, and Catherine's breath caught despite her best efforts at composure. The room was magnificent, its walls hung with silk, its floor polished to a mirror shine. An orchestra occupied a raised platform at one end, and guests in their finest attire filled the space with colour and movement and the buzz of conversation. A hush fell as they entered. Catherine felt dozens of eyes fix upon her, assessing, speculating, judging. She kept her expression serene and her hand light on the Duke's arm as he guided her through the crowd, making introductions with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything. "Lord Whitmore, may I present Miss Catherine Fairmont, daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont. Miss Fairmont, Lord and Lady Whitmore are our nearest neighbours." The introductions blurred together, names and titles, faces both curious and calculating. Through it all, the Duke remained at her side, a wall of aristocratic authority that simultaneously protected and imprisoned her. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he led her onto the floor without asking. His hand settled at her waist, with the same impersonal precision a chess player might use to move a piece. "You will smile," he instructed as they began to move. "But not too much. You will look at me, but with reserve. We are testing possibilities, not declaring certainties." Catherine followed his lead through the steps, acutely conscious of how perfectly he danced, how many eyes watched them. "You've choreographed this quite thoroughly, Your Grace." "I choreograph everything, Miss Fairmont. It's how I ensure outcomes match intentions." They completed the dance in silence after that, though Catherine was aware of his gaze occasionally dropping to her face, assessing her performance. When the music ended, he returned her to the edge of the floor where other guests immediately surrounded them with questions thinly disguised as pleasantries. It was during this barrage of polite interrogation that Catherine first noticed the woman watching from across the ballroom. She was perhaps 29, with hair so pale it was nearly platinum, arranged in elaborate curls that must have taken hours to achieve. Her dress was crimson silk cut daringly low, and her eyes, a warm brown that contrasted strikingly with her hair, fixed on Catherine with unmistakable hostility. The woman began moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of one who knew her power. Catherine felt the Duke stiffen slightly beside her, the first real reaction she had observed from him all evening. "Lady Philippa Hartley," he murmured, so quietly only Catherine could hear. "My late grandmother's goddaughter." "Be courteous but firm." Lady Philippa approached with a smile that reached her lips, but not her eyes. "Your Grace, what a delightful surprise. I had no idea you were entertaining this evening." "A small gathering, Lady Philippa, nothing requiring general invitation." The Duke's tone could have frozen water. "Indeed?" Philippa's gaze moved to Catherine, assessment sharp as a blade. "And you must be the mysterious Miss Fairmont everyone is whispering about. How lovely to meet you." Catherine executed a curtsy. "Lady Philippa, the pleasure is mine." "Is it?" Philippa's smile widened. "You must tell me all about yourself. His Grace has been so remarkably close-mouthed about your connection to his family." Before Catherine could formulate a response that was both truthful and discreet, the Duke intervened. "Miss Fairmont is my guest, Philippa. That is the extent of what requires explanation." The two regarded each other for a long moment, some unspoken communication passing between them that Catherine could not decipher. Then Philippa's smile turned brittle. "Of course, Your Grace. Forgive my curiosity." She inclined her head to Catherine. "We must speak further, Miss Fairmont. I find myself fascinated by anyone who captures His Grace's attention, however temporarily." She glided away, leaving a wake of expensive perfume and implicit threat. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of faces and forced pleasantries. Catherine danced the required second dance with the Duke, endured countless questions about her connection to him, and maintained the carefully neutral expression he had demanded. By the time the last guest departed near midnight, exhaustion pulled at every muscle. She was making her way toward the stairs when Mrs. Winslow appeared at her elbow. "A word, miss, if you don't mind." They retreated to a small sitting room off the main hall. The housekeeper's kind face held concern. "I thought you should know about Lady Philippa," Mrs. Winslow began carefully. "She and His Grace were, well, there was an expectation after her husband's death last year. She's been in mourning, but that period ended recently. Many assumed His Grace would propose." Catherine sank into a chair, understanding flooding through her. "I've been brought here to discourage those assumptions." "Among other reasons, yes." Mrs. Winslow hesitated. "Lady Philippa is not accustomed to disappointment, miss. I'd counsel caution in your dealings with her." When Catherine finally reached her rooms, she dismissed the maid and stood alone before the window, looking out at Windemere's darkened grounds. Somewhere in this vast house, the Duke sat in his study or his private chambers, no doubt satisfied that the first night had proceeded according to plan. And somewhere, perhaps in one of the guest suites or her own nearby estate, Lady Philippa Hartley plotted her response to this unexpected obstacle. Catherine pressed her forehead against the cool glass and whispered into the darkness, "What have I agreed to?" But she knew the answer. 30 nights. 29 remained. The mornings at Windemere Hall settled into a rhythm as predictable as the chiming of the clock in the entrance hall. Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked gardens more extensive than anything she had imagined during her years in London. A maid brought breakfast on a tray of silver and porcelain, and then Catherine was left to her own devices until the evening's social obligations commenced. On the fourth morning, after nights 2 and 3 had passed in a blur of smaller dinners and musicales that followed the same carefully choreographed pattern as the first ball, Catherine decided to explore the house more thoroughly. The Duke had made it clear during a brief encounter in the breakfast room that his days were occupied with estate business, and she should consider herself free to use the public rooms as she wished. She found the library quite by accident, opening a door she had assumed led to another drawing room. Instead, she stepped into a space that stole her breath with its unexpected magnificence. The room rose 2 full stories, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books bound in leather of every conceivable colour. A gallery ran around the upper level, accessed by a graceful spiral staircase of wrought iron. Tall windows on the eastern wall flooded the space with morning light that caught dancing motes of dust and made the air itself seem golden. Catherine moved forward as though in a dream, her fingers trailing along the spines nearest her. History, philosophy, poetry, novels both respectable and scandalous. The collection must have represented decades, perhaps centuries, of accumulated knowledge. His Grace's great-grandfather began the collection. Mrs. Winslow's voice came from the doorway, making Catherine start. Each generation has added to it. His Grace himself is quite devoted to reading, though he'd never admit such a thing publicly. It's magnificent, Catherine breathed. I haven't seen this many books since my father's library was sold to satisfy his creditors. The housekeeper's expression softened with sympathy. You're welcome to read anything that interests you, miss. His Grace was quite specific that you should have full access to all the public rooms. Over the following days, Catherine established a pattern. Mornings in the library, reading, or simply sitting in the window seat that overlooked the rose gardens. Afternoons spent walking the grounds when weather permitted, or writing letters to the few acquaintances who might still remember her from her former life. And evenings, always the evenings, when she transformed into the Duke's carefully maintained fiction. Night 4 was a dinner for 20, night 5 a card party, night 6 another ball, this one more formal than the first. Through it all, Adrian Carlyle maintained the same cold precision he had demonstrated from the beginning. He danced with her exactly twice at each ball. He sat beside her at dinners, making conversation that was perfectly pleasant and utterly impersonal. He touched her only when required by social convention, and then with a restraint that suggested he found even that contact distasteful. Catherine told herself she was grateful for his distance. Their arrangement was a business transaction, nothing more. Yet she could not help but notice how he tensed whenever proximity was required, how his gaze would drift away from hers even as he spoke to her, how he seemed to hold himself under such rigid control that she wondered what might happen if that control ever slipped. The days that followed blurred into one another. Quiet breakfasts, polite dinners, and carefully timed appearances that satisfied the household's watchful eyes, even when no grand party was scheduled. Nights 7, 8, and 9 passed in that restrained rhythm, each one witnessed in small, proper ways, until Catherine stopped measuring time by hope and started measuring it by endurance. It was on the 10th morning, as Catherine sat reading in the library, that Mrs. Winslow found her again. The housekeeper carried a tea tray, which she set on a small table near the window seat. I hope I'm not intruding, miss, but I thought you might welcome some refreshment. You're very kind, Mrs. Winslow. Catherine set aside her book and accepted the cup of tea gratefully. I hope I haven't been too much trouble these past days. No trouble at all, miss. In fact, it's been pleasant having someone appreciate the library. His Grace rarely has time for it anymore, though he used to spend hours here as a boy. The housekeeper settled into a chair nearby, her expression thoughtful. You've been wondering about him, haven't you? About why he keeps such distance? Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. It's not my place to wonder about His Grace's personal matters. Perhaps not, but you're here in his home, playing a role in his life, however temporary. It seems only fair you understand something of what shaped him. Mrs. Winslow paused, as though weighing how much to reveal. His Grace was engaged once, 9 years ago, to Lady Helena Pembroke, a beauty from an old family. Everyone thought it a perfect match. Catherine set down her teacup, giving the housekeeper her full attention. The wedding was planned for June of that year. The guests were invited, the settlements signed, everything arranged. Mrs. Winslow's voice grew quieter. A week before the ceremony, Lady Helena disappeared. She left a note saying she couldn't go through with the marriage, that she was sorry, but she had to follow her heart elsewhere. How terrible, Catherine murmured. It gets worse, I'm afraid. When His Grace's solicitors investigated, they discovered that Lady Helena had systematically emptied several accounts His Grace had put in her name as wedding gifts. Nearly £20,000, miss. She'd been planning the theft for months, using the engagement as cover for her scheme. She was never seen in England again. The pieces began falling into place. The Duke's insistence on clear contracts, his emphasis on discretion and defined terms, his visible discomfort with physical proximity. He had been betrayed by someone he trusted, someone he had presumably loved, and the wound had never properly healed. He was only 25, Mrs. Winslow continued, young enough to still believe in romance and trust. After that, he became what you see now, controlled, distant, unwilling to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. Thank you for telling me, Catherine said softly. It helps me understand. The housekeeper rose, collecting the tea tray. I thought it might, miss. His Grace is a good man beneath all that coldness. He treats his tenants fairly, supports his staff generously, fulfills his duties to the estate and the title with absolute dedication. But he's forgotten how to be anything other than the Duke. Perhaps forgotten he ever was anything else. After Mrs. Winslow departed, Catherine sat for a long time staring out at the gardens. She thought of the Duke at 25, young and presumably open-hearted, planning a future with a woman who had been systematically robbing him. No wonder he looked at Catherine with such careful assessment, weighing every word and gesture for signs of deception. No wonder he had chosen someone desperate and documented, whose circumstances made her predictable. She was still sitting there when voices in the entrance hall announced a new arrival. Catherine moved to the library door in time to see a young man handing his hat and gloves to a footman. He was perhaps 28, with light brown hair and eyes of a paler blue than the Duke's, dressed in riding clothes that suggested he had just arrived from a journey. Eddie! The Duke's voice, carrying from his study, held more warmth than Catherine had yet heard from him. You received my letter, then? Did you expect otherwise? The younger man's grin was infectious. When my brother summons me to witness his latest social manoeuvring, how could I possibly refuse? The two embraced briefly, and Catherine saw genuine affection in the gesture. This, then, was Edmund Carlyle, the Duke's younger brother whom Mrs. Winslow had mentioned in passing. Edmund's gaze found Catherine standing in the library doorway, and his expression shifted to open curiosity. And you must be the mysterious Miss Fairmont who has set the entire county talking. Edmund, the Duke's voice carried a note of warning. But Edmund was already crossing the hall, bowing over Catherine's hand with considerably more flourish than his brother had ever displayed. Edmund Carlyle, at your service. Younger, more charming brother to his Grace, the Duke of Gloom over there. Despite herself, Catherine laughed. Catherine Fairmont, Mr. Carlyle. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. The pleasure is entirely mine, I assure you. Edmund's eyes were kind as well as curious. Tell me, has my brother been treating you well? He has a tendency toward excessive formality that can be rather off-putting. Edmund. The Duke's tone had gone cold. A word in my study, if you please. Of course, of course. Edmund winked at Catherine. We'll speak more at dinner, Miss Fairmont. I want to hear all about how you've managed to tolerate Adrian's company for an entire week. The brothers disappeared into the study, their voices rising and falling in animated conversation that Catherine could not quite make out. She returned to her book, but found her attention wandering. Edmund Carlyle was everything his brother was not: warm, open, immediately friendly. It was difficult to believe they shared blood. At dinner that evening, Edmund proved to be exactly the presence the rigid formality of Windemere Hall needed. He kept the conversation flowing, drew Catherine out with questions about her reading and interests, and even managed to coax something approaching a smile from his brother. So tell me, Miss Fairmont, Edmund said over the fish course, what do you make of our little corner of Kent? I know Adrian's been keeping you busy with endless social obligations, but have you had time to explore the estate itself? Some, Catherine replied. The gardens are beautiful and the library is extraordinary. Your great-grandfather had excellent taste in books. Our great-grandfather was a notorious rake who collected books the way other men collected mistresses, Edmund said cheerfully, ignoring his brother's sharp look. But he did have good taste, I'll grant you that. Adrian, you should show Miss Fairmont the Folly by the lake. The view at sunset is quite something. Perhaps, the Duke replied non-committally. Later, after the Duke had excused himself to attend to correspondence, Edmund found Catherine in the drawing room, where she had retreated with a book. May I join you? He asked. Or would you prefer solitude? Please sit. Catherine gestured to a nearby chair. Your company is most welcome. Edmund settled himself, his expression growing more serious. I wanted to speak with you privately, Miss Fairmont, about Adrian and this arrangement you've entered into. Catherine felt her defences rise. Mr. Carlyle, I assure you everything is perfectly proper. I'm not questioning the propriety, he interrupted gently. I'm questioning my brother's motives, or perhaps his lack of self-awareness regarding them. He leaned forward. Our grandmother was a remarkable woman, Miss Fairmont. She loved Adrian deeply, but she worried about him, especially after the business with Lady Helena. When she created that clause in her will, forcing him to demonstrate intent toward marriage, she wasn't really concerned about the estate passing to our cousin. She was trying to save Adrian from himself. I'm not sure I understand. Adrian has spent 9 years building walls around himself, convincing himself that duty and control are sufficient substitutes for human connection. Grandmother's will was her attempt to force him to at least consider an alternative. Edmund's gaze was direct. I don't know what financial arrangement brought you here, and I don't need to know. But I wanted you to understand that you're not just helping my brother satisfy a legal requirement. You're part of grandmother's last attempt to remind him he's human. Before Catherine could respond, raised voices from the entrance hall interrupted them. A woman's voice, imperious and familiar, cut through the evening quiet. I don't require an invitation, Harrington. His Grace will want to see me. Catherine and Edmund exchanged glances and moved to the drawing-room door. In the entrance hall, Lady Philippa Hartley stood arguing with the butler, her colour high and her eyes bright with some strong emotion. The Duke emerged from his study, his expression darkening when he saw their unexpected guest. Philippa, this is unannounced. Indeed, Philippa's smile was brittle. But given the circumstances, I thought a frank conversation might be in order. About your guest, and what exactly you think you're accomplishing with this farce. The Duke's voice went dangerously quiet. My private affairs are not subject to your approval or commentary. Your private affairs? Philippa laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. The entire county is talking, Adrian. About you and that penniless spinster you've installed in your home. About the convenient timing, given the terms of your grandmother's will. About what sort of arrangement could possibly exist between a duke and a woman, with nothing to recommend her but desperation. Catherine felt the words land like blows, each one calculated to wound. She saw Edmund stiffen beside her, saw the Duke's hands clench at his sides. You will leave, Adrian said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of generations of aristocratic command. Now, and you will not return to Windemere unless explicitly invited, which I assure you will not occur. Is that sufficiently clear, Lady Philippa? Crystal clear, Your Grace. Philippa's gaze found Catherine across the hall. But before I go, perhaps Miss Fairmont should know what everyone else has already guessed. That you've purchased her presence to serve your purposes, that she's nothing more than a convenient prop in your little theatrical production, and that when the 30 nights are complete, you'll discard her as easily as you engaged her. The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine felt every eye in the hall upon her, waiting for her response to this public humiliation. She thought of her room in London, of counting coins and dodging creditors, of the desperation that had brought her to this place. She thought of Lady Helena Pembroke, who had used an engagement as cover for theft, and she thought of the Duke, frozen in the entrance hall with something that might have been shame flickering across his usually impassive features. She drew herself up to her full height and walked forward with all the dignity her father had taught her a viscount's daughter should possess. Lady Philippa, she said, her voice perfectly steady, you are quite correct that His Grace and I have an arrangement, one that is both temporary and mutually beneficial. I entered into it with full knowledge of its terms and limitations. Whatever you imagine you're revealing, I assure you I was already aware. Now, as His Grace has requested, perhaps you should leave. Philippa's expression shifted between fury and grudging respect. Without another word, she swept out, leaving a wake of expensive perfume and implied threat. The door closed behind her. The Duke turned to Catherine, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was unguarded. Miss Fairmont, Your Grace, she interrupted, might I suggest we postpone any discussion until tomorrow? I find I'm quite tired. She made her way up the stairs with measured steps, feeling his gaze follow her retreat. Only when she reached her room and closed the door behind her did she allow her composure to crack, sinking onto the bed with trembling hands. Below, in the entrance hall, Edmund clapped his brother on the shoulder. "Well, that was entertaining. And Adrian, that woman has more spine than you gave her credit for." The Duke said nothing, staring at the stairs where Catherine had disappeared, an expression of something that might have been wonder crossing his features before he locked it away again. The first third of their arrangement was complete. 20 remained, overall. And somehow, Catherine suspected, everything had just become considerably more complicated. The morning after Lady Philippa's dramatic departure brought an unexpected development. Catherine descended for breakfast to find the Duke already in the morning room, a circumstance previously unknown during her time at Windemere. He typically took his breakfast in his study while reviewing correspondence, maintaining the careful distance that characterized all their interactions. He rose when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed somehow more significant in the intimacy of the small room. "Miss Fairmont," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual coolness. "I hoped I might find you here. I owe you an apology for last evening's unpleasantness." Catherine accepted the chair he held for her, acutely conscious of his proximity as he returned to his own seat. "You are not responsible for Lady Philippa's actions, Your Grace." "Perhaps not, but I am responsible for the situation that provoked them." He set down his coffee cup with unusual care, as though the porcelain required delicate handling. "Your defense of our arrangement was both gracious and unnecessary. I should have prevented her from speaking to you in such a manner." "I am quite capable of defending myself when required," Catherine replied, accepting tea from a hovering footman. "Lady Philippa said nothing I had not already considered regarding the nature of our agreement." Something flickered across the Duke's face, an expression Catherine could not quite identify before his usual composure reasserted itself. "Nevertheless, I am in your debt. Your discretion and composure under difficult circumstances have been exemplary." They completed the meal in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less rigid somehow, as though some invisible barrier had been fractionally lowered. The 11th night brought a dinner for 30 guests, and Catherine noticed immediately that something had shifted. When the Duke sat beside her, he did not simply maintain the fiction of polite interest. He actually asked questions about her day, about what she had been reading, about her thoughts on the estate's gardens. "I spent the afternoon in the library," Catherine replied, surprised by his genuine attention. "Your collection of travel narratives is quite extensive." "I was reading about expeditions to Egypt. My father commissioned several of those volumes," Adrian said, and there was real warmth in his voice. He never travelled himself, which perhaps made him more interested in accounts of those who did. "Have you travelled much, Miss Fairmont?" "Never beyond England, Your Grace. My circumstances—" She hesitated, then continued. "My circumstances have not permitted extensive travel." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "That seems a grave oversight. Someone with your evident appreciation for knowledge and culture should have the opportunity to experience the world beyond books." Over the following nights, these conversations continued. During the 12th night's musicale, the Duke asked about her education, and Catherine found herself describing her father's library, the governess who had taught her more than was strictly appropriate for a young lady, her mother's insistence that she learn to read French and Italian, even if she would never use those languages in society. "My father believed knowledge was its own reward," she said quietly, aware that other guests were watching them with undisguised curiosity. "He used to say that a mind furnished with books could never be truly impoverished, regardless of financial circumstances." "A wise man," Adrian replied, though I suspect he could not have anticipated how severely those circumstances would test his philosophy. Catherine met his gaze directly. "No." But he was correct nonetheless. The 3 years after his death were difficult in every material sense, but I had my memories of his teachings, my love of reading, my education. Those things sustained me when little else could. On the 13th night, as she prepared for bed, Catherine found herself standing at her window and reflecting on the strangeness of her situation. Weeks ago, she had been counting coins in a freezing room, facing imprisonment for debts not of her making. Now she wore silk nightdresses and slept in luxury beyond anything she had known even in her father's house. The financial relief was immense, She no longer woke in the night with her heart pounding, imagining the sound of bailiffs at the door. The creditors were satisfied. Her immediate future was secured. But in place of that terror had come something more complicated, an awareness of the Duke as something more than the cold aristocrat who had purchased her presence. She thought of how his voice softened when he spoke of his father's love of travel narratives, how his eyes had held genuine interest when she discussed her education, how, increasingly, he seemed to forget they were performing for an audience and simply talked with her as one might with what? A friend? The word seemed too intimate, yet nothing else quite fit. The 14th night brought another dinner, this one for local gentry and their families. Catherine wore a gown of deep rose silk and found herself seated beside the Duke for the entire meal. The conversation around them flowed in the usual patterns: gossip about mutual acquaintances, discussion of upcoming county events, speculation about political developments in London. But between Catherine and Adrian, something else was happening. He told her, in response to a question she had asked, about the frustrations of managing an estate the size of Windemere, how every decision affected dozens of families who depended on the land for their livelihoods, how the weight of that responsibility sometimes felt crushing, particularly when balanced against expectations from society, from distant relatives who thought they knew better, from a legacy of dukes stretching back 200 years. "I sometimes wonder," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "who I might have been if I had been born the second son instead of the heir. If I could have pursued interest beyond duty and obligation." Catherine understood in that moment that she was not the only person at this table wearing a mask. His was simply more practiced, carved from years of training in how a duke should behave, what he should want, who he should be. "What would you have pursued?" she asked. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his austere features into something approaching warmth. "Law, perhaps, or architecture. I've always been fascinated by how buildings are constructed, how form and function must balance. But such interests are considered beneath a duke's concern. That seems terribly limiting. It is the price of privilege, Miss Fairmont. We are not free to choose our paths, as others might be." Before she could respond, the conversation shifted and the moment passed. But something had been revealed, a glimpse beneath the armour of aristocratic duty to the man who might have existed in different circumstances. The 15th night arrived with a storm. Catherine dressed for what was to be a card party, but by evening the wind had risen to a shriek and rain lashed the windows with a violence that made travel impossible. Messengers arrived from neighbouring estates with regrets. No one would venture out in such weather. Mrs. Winslow appeared at Catherine's door as she was fastening her necklace. "His Grace asks if you would join him for dinner, miss. Just the two of you, given that tonight's gathering has been cancelled." Mrs. Winslow hesitated, then added that Harrington would serve the first course in the room, and that she herself would remain nearby. It sounded like mere household protocol, but Catherine understood the undercurrent. Even a storm could not erase an obligation that had to be seen to be believed. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. For the first time since arriving at Windemere, she and the Duke would dine without an audience, without the need to perform their carefully choreographed fiction. She descended to find the dining room transformed. Instead of the long, formal table set for dozens, a small table had been arranged near the fireplace, where flames danced and crackled, warming the space against the storm's fury. The Duke stood when she entered, his evening dress as impeccable as always, but something in his bearing suggested a man who had shed some invisible burden. "Miss Fairmont," he gestured to a chair, "I hope you don't mind the informality. Given the circumstances, it seemed pointless to maintain the full formality of a state dinner for two." "Not at all, Your Grace. It's quite comfortable." They began the meal in silence, but gradually conversation emerged. Without guests to impress or society's eyes to consider, their words came more freely. The Duke asked about her childhood, and Catherine found herself describing days spent in her father's library, reading while rain pattered against windows much like tonight's storm. "I loved days like this," she admitted. "My mother would scold that I should be practicing needlework or watercolours, but father would defend me. He said a rainy day was meant for books and contemplation. My childhood was considerably less idyllic," Adrian said, refilling her wineglass. My father believed preparation for the dukedom required constant discipline. Rainy days meant additional lessons in estate management or genealogy. By the time I was 12, I could recite every Duke of Windemere back to the title's creation in 1563. That sounds rather lonely. He paused, his wineglass halfway to his lips. It was, but I was taught that loneliness was irrelevant compared to duty, that personal desires were secondary to the requirements of the title. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows. Catherine saw him glance toward the storm, then back to her, his expression holding something she had not seen before, uncertainty. May I ask you something, Miss Fairmont? A question that has no bearing on our arrangement, that requires no answer if you find it too personal. Of course. Why did you accept my proposition? I know the financial aspect was significant, but was that truly all? You might have found other solutions, even if less immediately lucrative. Catherine considered her answer carefully. You're correct that the money was crucial, but I would be dishonest if I claimed it was the only factor. I had spent 3 years watching my world shrink. Every possession sold, every friend lost to the embarrassment of my circumstances, every opportunity denied because I no longer had the connections or resources to seize them. Your offer was not just financial salvation. It was a chance, however temporary, to experience a world I thought I had lost forever. The words hung between them in the firelit room while the storm raged beyond the windows. I understand that more than you might imagine, Adrian said finally. The world I inhabit is not one I chose. It chose me by accident of birth. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to simply be Adrian Carlyle, without the weight of the dukedom attached. Who would you be? Catherine asked softly. He met her eyes across the small table. I'm not entirely certain anymore. The Duke has so thoroughly subsumed the man that I've rather lost track of where one ends and the other begins. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous warming toward this man who had purchased 30 nights of her company. This was not part of their arrangement. Empathy, understanding, even friendship. These were complications neither had anticipated. As if sensing the same danger, Adrian leaned back slightly, re-establishing distance. Forgive me. The storm and the wine have made me maudlin. There is nothing to forgive, Your Grace. They finished the meal with lighter conversation, but the intimacy of what had been shared lingered between them like smoke from the dying fire. The 16th night brought a return to formality that felt jarring after the storm's revelation. Another dinner. More guests, the same careful choreography of glances and conversation. But Adrian had retreated behind his walls, his voice cool and distant, his touches when required as impersonal as a handshake from a stranger. Catherine told herself she was grateful for the return to established boundaries. Their arrangement had specific terms, and emotional entanglement would only complicate the inevitable conclusion. Yet she could not shake a sense of disappointment, of something lost that she had not realized she wanted until it was gone. Edmund noticed the change immediately. On the 17th evening, he found Catherine in the library before dinner. My brother is being an idiot, he announced, without preamble. Catherine looked up from her book, startled. Mr. Carlyle, I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. Edmund settled into a nearby chair. For one evening, he allowed himself to be human with you, to actually connect with another person, and now he's terrified, so he's retreated back into being the Duke of Ice. Our arrangement has specific parameters. Hang the arrangement, Edmund interrupted. Miss Fairmont, I've known my brother his entire life. I saw what Lady Helena's betrayal did to him. But I also saw, for one brief evening during that storm, something I haven't witnessed in 9 years. He was actually present in his own life, actually engaged with another person, actually allowing himself to feel something beyond duty and control. Catherine said nothing, but her hands tightened on her book. Don't let him waste this, Edmund continued. Whatever this connection is between you, however temporary you both insist it must be, it's real. And my brother needs something real more than he's needed anything in a very long time. The 18th night arrived with a flurry of preparation. This was to be the largest event yet. a formal ball with guests travelling from London specifically for the occasion. Mrs. Winslow had arranged for Catherine's most elaborate gown, a creation of emerald silk that brought out the green of her eyes and set off her dark hair. When Catherine descended the stairs that evening, she was acutely conscious of how much had changed since that first ball nearly 3 weeks ago. She was no longer the frightened woman desperate to fulfill a contract. She had found her place in these gatherings, learned to navigate the conversations and expectations. She was comfortable in this world, even knowing it was only borrowed. The Duke waited at the base of the stairs, magnificent in his evening dress. But when his eyes found her, something in his carefully maintained composure cracked. His gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary, travelled over her in a way that was not quite proper, returned to her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Miss Fairmont," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You look extraordinary." Throughout the evening, Catherine felt his attention like a physical weight. During their first dance, his hand at her waist burned through the silk of her gown. During dinner, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. During their second dance, near midnight, when the ball had reached its crescendo, they moved together in perfect synchronization, as though they had danced together 1,000 times before. 12 nights remain, he said quietly as they turned. The first month will be complete. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian, he said, when we're alone, or nearly so, I would prefer you call me Adrian. Catherine's breath caught. That seems rather beyond the scope of our arrangement. Perhaps, he agreed. But then, many things have become rather beyond the initial scope, haven't they? The music ended before she could respond, but as he led her from the floor, his hand remained at the small of her back, a warmth and pressure that suggested possession, protection, something far more complicated than their carefully defined contract. In the carriage house, a groom watching through the window remarked to his companion, "His Grace hasn't looked at a lady that way since before the business with Lady Helena. Mark my words, something's changing." And in the ballroom, as Adrian and Catherine moved through the crowd with all eyes upon them, something was indeed changing. What had started as a bargain was becoming something neither had anticipated, and both were too cautious to name. 18 nights complete. 12 remained, and the careful walls they had constructed were beginning to crumble. The morning of the 19th day dawned grey and cold, a harbinger of the complications that would soon descend upon Windemere Hall. Catherine was in the library, attempting to concentrate on a volume of poetry, when the sound of carriages on the gravel drive drew her attention to the window. 2 vehicles approached, both bearing crests she did not recognise. From the first emerged Lady Philippa Hartley, her expression set in lines of grim determination. From the second descended a man of perhaps 60 years, dressed in the severe black of the legal profession, carrying a leather case that suggested official business. Catherine's stomach tightened with apprehension. Whatever this was, it did not bode well. Within minutes, Harrington the butler appeared at the library door. "Miss Fairmont, His Grace requests your presence in the drawing room immediately." The scene that greeted her when she entered was charged with barely contained hostility. Adrian stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid with controlled anger. Edmund sat in a chair by the window, his usual easy manner replaced by watchful tension. Philippa occupied the settee with the proprietary air of one who believed herself entitled to be there, and beside her sat the man from the second carriage, his sharp features and calculating eyes marking him as the sort who made his living from other people's misfortunes. "Ah, Miss Fairmont." Philippa's smile held no warmth. "How convenient. We were just discussing you." Adrian's voice cut across whatever Philippa might have said next. "Miss Fairmont, allow me to introduce Mr. Malcolm Pritchard, Lady Philippa's solicitor. He has come from London with certain allegations regarding our arrangement." "Allegations seems rather strong, Your Grace," Pritchard said, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of practiced diplomacy. "Concerns would be a more appropriate term. Concerns regarding the propriety and legality of your current domestic situation." "My domestic situation is none of your concern," Adrian replied coldly. On the contrary, when it potentially affects the validity of the late Dowager Duchess's testament, it becomes a matter of legitimate legal interest. Pritchard opened his case and withdrew several documents. The clause requiring you to demonstrate intent toward establishing a family was clearly meant to encourage genuine courtship, not the employment of a paid companion to create false appearances. Catherine felt heat flood her cheeks even as she maintained her composure. So this was to be the attack, not on her character directly, but on the arrangement itself. Mr. Greaves drew up the contract personally, Adrian said. I'm certain he ensured its complete legality. Legality and propriety are not always synonymous, Your Grace. Pritchard's smile was thin. The terms of your grandmother's will speak of intent toward marriage, toward family. Housing a woman of questionable circumstances under your roof, regardless of whatever financial arrangement exists between you, hardly constitutes such intent in the eyes of society or law. Questionable circumstances, Catherine heard herself say, her voice steady despite her rising anger. My circumstances are the result of my father's financial misfortunes, not any moral failing on my part. Pritchard turned his assessing gaze upon her. Of course, Miss Fairmont. No one is impugning your character. We are merely questioning whether His Grace's current arrangements fulfill the spirit of his grandmother's requirements. And I suppose Lady Philippa's interest in this matter is purely legal in nature, Edmund interjected from his position by the window. Philippa's expression hardened. My interest is in seeing that the Dowager Duchess's wishes are properly honoured, not circumvented through clever manipulation. How noble, Edmund drawled. Before the situation could escalate further, another carriage announced its arrival. This time, the passenger was Tobias Greaves, clearly summoned by urgent message from Adrian. The elderly solicitor entered with the dignity of one who had practiced law for 40 years and was not easily intimidated by younger colleagues. Mr. Pritchard, Greaves acknowledged him with a curt nod. I understand you have concerns regarding a contract I personally drafted and witnessed. What followed was an hour of legal debate that made Catherine's head ache. Pritchard argued that the arrangement constituted fraud upon the testament's intent. Greaves countered with precedents and interpretations that demonstrated the letter of the law had been scrupulously followed. Adrian stood silent throughout, his expression growing darker as the implications of Philippa's scheme became clear. Finally, Greaves gathered his documents. I believe we have reached an impasse, Mr. Pritchard. If you wish to challenge the validity of His Grace's arrangements in court, you are welcome to do so. However, I should warn you that such a case would require extensive documentation and would inevitably expose Lady Philippa's motivations to public scrutiny. I'm not certain she would welcome such examination. Pritchard's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening my client, Mr. Greaves? I am merely noting the natural consequences of legal action. Public proceedings tend toward publicity. Greaves smiled blandly. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe this meeting has concluded. After Pritchard and Philippa departed, an uneasy silence settled over the drawing room. Catherine felt the weight of what had just occurred pressing down upon her. The arrangement that had seemed so straightforward a few weeks ago was now the subject of legal manoeuvring and social warfare. I should leave, she said quietly. My presence is clearly causing more problems than it solves. Absolutely not. Adrian's voice was sharp. You have fulfilled your obligations perfectly. Philippa's machinations are not your responsibility. But over the following days, it became clear that Philippa had no intention of conceding defeat. Letters began arriving from London, bringing gossip and speculation that had spread through society with the speed of wildfire. The scandal sheets, always hungry for aristocratic drama, printed veiled references to the Duke of Windemere's unusual domestic arrangements. Edmund, ever resourceful, departed for London on the 21st morning with a promise to investigate. Philippa is desperate, he told Catherine privately before his departure. Desperate people make mistakes, and I intend to discover what hers have been. The 22nd night brought a small dinner party, and Catherine endured the curious and sometimes judgmental glances of guests who had clearly read the London papers. She maintained her composure through the meal, through the interminable post-dinner conversation, through the careful dance of social obligation. Afterward, seeking air and solitude, She retreated to the gardens. The autumn night was cold but clear, stars brilliant against the black sky. She walked among the rose bushes, now largely dormant for winter, trying to organize her thoughts. Miss Fairmont. Catherine turned to find Philippa emerging from the shadows near the terrace. The other woman must have remained behind after the other guests departed. Lady Philippa. Catherine kept her voice neutral. I thought you had left with the others. I wanted to speak with you privately. Philippa moved closer, her beautiful face hard in the moonlight. To give you fair warning. Warning of what? I know about the money, about your debts, about the desperation that brought you here. Philippa's voice was low and intense. I know because I've been desperate too. My late husband left me with nothing but debts and a title. I need Adrian's wealth as much as you apparently did. The difference is, I have a legitimate claim to his attention. Catherine studied the other woman, seeing past the beauty and confidence to the fear beneath. You love him. Love, Philippa laughed bitterly. Love is a luxury for those who can afford it. I need security, position, the means to maintain my place in society. Adrian can provide all of that. And you believe I'm an obstacle to obtaining it. I know you are. Philippa stepped closer still, which is why I'm giving you this opportunity to leave voluntarily. If you don't, I will ensure that certain information about your past reaches the newspapers. Information about debts, about creditors, about just how close you came to debtor's prison. I will paint you as a fortune hunter and an opportunist, and I will make certain no one in society ever receives you again. Catherine felt anger rise within her, clean and sharp. Do what you believe you must, Lady Philippa, but I will not be intimidated into abandoning my obligations because you've decided I'm inconvenient to your plans. Philippa's expression shifted to something almost like respect. You have more spine than I credited you with, Miss Fairmont. Pity it won't be enough to protect you from what's coming. She swept away, leaving Catherine alone in the cold garden with her racing thoughts. When she returned to the house, she found Adrian waiting in the entrance hall. One look at her face told him something had occurred. What happened? His voice held an edge she had not heard before. Catherine hesitated, then decided honesty was the only viable path. I encountered Lady Philippa in the garden. She made certain threats regarding my reputation should I not voluntarily depart Windemere. Adrian's expression darkened dangerously. What manner of threats? Catherine recounted the conversation, watching as his anger transformed from cold to white-hot. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. I will handle this, he said finally. Lady Philippa has gone too far. The following morning, Adrian requested Philippa's presence at Windemere for a private conversation. Catherine watched from the library window as the woman's carriage arrived, saw her enter with the confidence of one who believed herself in control of the situation. She did not remain confident for long. The raised voices carried even through the closed door of Adrian's study. Catherine could not make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. When Philippa finally emerged, her face was pale, her composure shattered. Adrian followed her to the entrance hall, his voice carrying clearly now. If you persist in this campaign against Miss Fairmont, I will personally ensure that your financial circumstances become common knowledge throughout London. I will reveal every debt your late husband left, every creditor you're currently evading, every desperate scheme you've attempted to secure a wealthy husband. Do I make myself sufficiently clear? Philippa's response was too quiet for Catherine to hear, but the defeat in her posture was evident. After she departed, Adrian found Catherine in the library. His anger had not diminished, but it was no longer directed at Philippa. I should have anticipated this, he said, without preamble. I should have protected you better from the consequences of my own arrangements. Your Grace. Adrian, he corrected. And I mean it, Catherine. I brought you here to serve my purposes, and in doing so, I've made you a target for Philippa's machinations. That was unconscionable. Catherine set down her book. You've been nothing but honourable in your dealings with me. Lady Philippa's actions are her own responsibility. He moved to the window, staring out at the gardens where their confrontation had occurred the previous night. She's not wrong about the desperation that drives people to accept circumstances they might otherwise refuse. I used your desperation, Catherine. just as she would have used mine if I'd given her the opportunity. The use of her given name sent warmth through Catherine's chest. Dangerous and unwelcome. Perhaps we've all used each other to some degree, she said quietly. The question is whether we've done so honestly and with clear terms. You have been nothing but direct about the nature of our arrangement. That cannot be said of Lady Philippa's intentions. Over the following days, as the 23rd, 24th and 25th nights passed, Catherine noticed a distinct change in Adrian's behaviour. He no longer limited his attention to the evening's social obligations. He began appearing during the day, seeking her out in the library or the gardens, engaging her in conversation that had nothing to do with their arrangement or the social performances required. He showed her the estate in ways she had not previously seen, the home farm where tenants brought their concerns, the village school his mother had established decades ago, the folly by the lake that Edmund had mentioned, where the view at sunset was indeed quite something. During these excursions, Adrian's carefully maintained distance began to crumble. He would offer his hand to help her over rough ground and forget to release it afterward. He would lean close to point out some feature of the landscape and remain there, his presence warm and solid beside her. He would laugh at her observations, real laughter that transformed his severe features into something approaching joy. Catherine told herself repeatedly that this was dangerous territory. Their arrangement had clear boundaries and a specific end date, but as they walked through autumn gold woods or sat by the lake watching swans glide across the water, those boundaries seemed increasingly arbitrary, less real than the connection growing between them. On the evening of the 25th night, as they returned from a walk that had stretched longer than intended, Catherine found herself reflecting on an uncomfortable truth. The financial relief that had brought her to Windemere was still important, still necessary, but it was no longer the most significant aspect of her time here. What had begun as a transaction was becoming something neither of them had anticipated, something that would make the inevitable conclusion of their arrangement far more complicated than either could have imagined when they first met in Tobias Greaves's office and agreed to 30 nights that would change everything. The 26th night arrived with an unexpected intimacy that caught Catherine unprepared. Rather than the usual formal dinner for dozens, Edmund had arranged something smaller, a private celebration in the smaller dining room that marked the approach of the arrangement's conclusion. Only 4 places were set, for Adrian, Catherine, Edmund, and Mrs. Winslow, who had been invited to join them as recognition of her years of service to the family. "I thought we might acknowledge the occasion without the usual theatrical production," Edmund explained as they gathered before dinner. 4 more nights, and the testament's requirements will be satisfied. That seems worth marking, even if we do so quietly. Catherine wore a gown of deep amber silk that brought warmth to her complexion in the candlelight. She had grown accustomed to fine clothes over the past weeks, but tonight she was acutely conscious of how different she looked from the woman who had arrived at Windemere nearly a month ago. The change was not merely in her attire, but in her bearing, her confidence, the way she moved through these rooms as though she belonged in them. The meal was more relaxed than any Catherine had experienced since her arrival. Edmund kept the conversation flowing with stories of his and Adrian's childhood, tales that revealed a warmth in their relationship that Adrian rarely displayed publicly. Mrs. Winslow contributed her own memories of the brothers as boys, painting a picture of Adrian before duty and disappointment had hardened him into the Duke of Windemere. "I remember when you were perhaps 8 years old, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her eyes soft with reminiscence. "You brought me a bouquet of wildflowers you'd picked yourself, because you'd heard me mention that I missed having a garden. Your father scolded you terribly for spending time on such frivolity, but you told him some things mattered more than duty." Adrian shifted uncomfortably, but something like warmth flickered across his features. "I'd forgotten that." "You've forgotten many things, I think," Mrs. Winslow said gently. "But perhaps you're beginning to remember." Her gaze moved meaningfully to Catherine, and the air in the room suddenly felt charged with unspoken significance. "I haven't seen you this animated in years," Mrs. Winslow continued, addressing Adrian directly. "Not since before that unfortunate business with Lady Helena 9 years ago." It's good to see you engaging with life again, Your Grace, rather than merely managing it. The comment landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward to touch everyone present. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks as she became acutely aware that the servants had noticed the shift in dynamics between her and the Duke, that what she had hoped might remain private and undefined was in fact obvious to anyone who cared to observe. After dinner, Edmund suggested port in the library, but Mrs. Winslow excused herself with the claim of early duties the following morning. As she departed, she squeezed Catherine's hand briefly, a gesture of support that made Catherine's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. In the library, Edmund poured drinks for the three of them and settled into his favourite chair near the fire. "So," he said, his usual levity absent from his voice, "4 more nights. What happens after that, Adrian?" Adrian stood at the window, his back to them both, his posture rigid. "The arrangement concludes as agreed. Miss Fairmont receives her final payment and returns to London, or wherever she chooses." "That's the contract," Edmund agreed. "But I'm asking what you want to happen. What I want is irrelevant to the terms we established." "Adrian." Edmund's voice carried a warning. "Don't be obtuse. I have eyes. So does every servant in this house, every guest who's attended your events. Something has changed between you and Miss Fairmont. Pretending otherwise is an insult to everyone's intelligence, particularly hers." Catherine set down her glass, preparing to excuse herself from this conversation that felt far too personal. But Adrian spoke before she could move. "What would you have me say, Edmund? That I've complicated a straightforward arrangement by developing feelings I have no right to feel? That I lie awake wondering how I'll manage when she's gone? That the thought of her returning to London, of never seeing her again, is unbearable?" His voice was low and strained. Would it help to admit any of that? The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed Adrian's words. He had not turned from the window, had not looked at her, but the raw honesty in his voice was undeniable. Edmund rose, walked to his brother, and gripped his shoulder. "Yes, you idiot. It would help enormously, because you're not the only person in this room whose feelings have become complicated." He glanced meaningfully at Catherine, then excused himself with the transparent fiction of needing to review correspondence. The door closed behind him, leaving Catherine alone with Adrian, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 10. Finally, Adrian turned from the window, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "That was inappropriate. Our arrangement has clear terms, and my personal feelings should not complicate your fulfillment of them." Catherine rose, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. "Your Grace, Adrian, do you truly believe your feelings are one-sided in this?" Something flared in his eyes, hope and fear warring visibly. "I dare not assume anything where you're concerned, Catherine. You came here out of desperation, accepted my proposal because you had few alternatives. Any feelings you might have developed could simply be gratitude, or the result of proximity and shared circumstances. Could they not be genuine?" she challenged. "Must every emotion be suspect simply because our beginning was transactional?" He moved toward her, closing the distance between them until she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the rapid pulse at his throat. "I don't know how to navigate this," he admitted. 9 years ago, I believed I understood love. I believed Helena when she said she cared for me. I was wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the consequences of that error taught me to trust nothing that cannot be verified in contracts and clear terms. And now?" Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "Now I find myself terrified that I'm making the same mistake. That what I feel is merely loneliness seeking connection, or desire masquerading as deeper emotion. I've constructed a life around certainty and control, Catherine. You represent neither." Catherine felt her eyes sting with unshed tears. "And I represent nothing more? Simply uncertainty and lack of control?" "No." The word was fierce. "You represent possibility, hope, the chance that I might be more than just the Duke of Windemere, that there might be room in my life for something beyond duty and obligation. But I'm terrified of reaching for that and discovering it was an illusion all along. So, what do you propose? Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the emotions roiling within her. That we simply end this as planned. That I leave in 4 days and we never speak of whatever this has become. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides, as though he physically restrained himself from reaching for her. I don't know. The contract specifies that final payment will be delivered upon completion of the 30 nights. After that, there are no more obligations binding us. Perhaps, he trailed off, uncertainty clear in every line of his body. Perhaps what? Perhaps we might consider an extension of some kind. Not another contract, but a genuine courtship. Time to discover if what we feel in this artificial situation holds true in the real world. Catherine's breath caught. It was both more and less than she had dared hope for. More because it acknowledged what had grown between them. Less because it still framed everything in terms of testing and verification. As though genuine emotion required the same validation as a business transaction. And if it doesn't, she asked, if we discover that our feelings were merely the product of circumstance, what then? Then we part as planned, with no harm done beyond what we've already risked. Catherine turned away, moving to the fireplace where flames danced hypnotically. You're still protecting yourself, she said quietly, still keeping one foot ready to step back if things become too difficult or uncertain. I understand why, given your past, but Adrian, she turned back to face him. That's not how genuine connection works. You cannot love someone while simultaneously planning your retreat. I'm not sure I know how to do anything else, he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her. Then perhaps we have nothing more to discuss until you decide whether you're willing to try. Catherine moved toward the door, needing distance, needing air, needing space to process everything that had just transpired. The arrangement concludes in 4 days, as agreed. After that, you know where to find me if you determine you're ready to risk something real. She left him standing in the library, his expression stricken, his hands still clenched at his sides. The 27th night brought another formal event, a dinner and cards for local gentry. Catherine dressed mechanically, her mind still churning with the previous evening's conversation. When she descended, Adrian was waiting, impeccably dressed as always, his expression carefully neutral. They moved through the evening like automatons, fulfilling their social obligations with practiced ease. But there was a new tension between them, a careful distance that everyone present seemed to sense. Catherine caught speculative glances from guests, whispered conversations that ceased when she drew near. After the guests had departed and the card tables were being cleared, Adrian approached her near the terrace doors. "Walk with me," he asked quietly. The October night was cold but clear. Stars brilliant against the black sky. They walked in silence through gardens now preparing for winter's dormancy, their breath misting in the chill air. Finally, near the fountain that had been drained for the season, Adrian stopped. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About protecting myself, about planning my retreat. You're correct. I've spent 9 years building walls, and I'm not certain I know how to dismantle them, even when I want to." Catherine waited, her heart in her throat. "But I want to try," he continued. "Catherine, He broke off, frustration evident in his voice. "I don't have pretty words for this. I'm not a romantic man, but I know that the thought of you leaving, of returning to a life where I have no place, is intolerable. I know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Not Helena, not anyone. And I know that if I let you walk away without at least attempting to discover if this could be something real and lasting, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "That's not a proposal for courtship, Adrian. That's a declaration that you're afraid of regret." "It's both," he countered. "Is that not how most relationships begin? With fear and hope tangled together, with the knowledge that reaching for connection always carries the risk of pain? And what if it is merely convenience masquerading as emotion?" Catherine asked, throwing his own fears back at him. "What if what you feel is simply gratitude that I've fulfilled my obligations, or attraction born of proximity? Then we'll discover that together." he said. But Catherine, I don't believe that's what this is. I know that you've become essential to me in ways I never anticipated. The question is whether you feel the same, or whether I'm once again deluding myself about another person's regard. Catherine stepped closer, close enough to see the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope he was trying so desperately to contain. I feel far more than is wise or safe, she admitted. But Adrian, feeling something and building something sustainable are not the same. Our entire relationship has been constructed on a foundation of contracts and clear terms. How do we transition from that to something real? Carefully, he said. Slowly, with honesty about our doubts and fears, with the understanding that I'm likely to make mistakes, to retreat when I should advance, to let past wounds color present circumstances. That doesn't sound particularly promising. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps not, but it's honest. Which is more than I offered Helena, or she offered me. If we're to have any chance, it must be built on truth, however uncomfortable. Before Catherine could respond, the sound of footsteps on gravel announced Edmund's approach. Forgive the interruption, he said, though his expression suggested anything but regret. But Adrian, you're needed inside. A messenger from London has arrived with urgent correspondence from Mr. Greaves. The spell broken, they returned to the house. Catherine made her way to her rooms, her mind spinning with everything that had and had not been said. 4 more nights, 72 hours to the conclusion of their arrangement, and she was no closer to understanding what would follow than she had been at the beginning. The 28th night passed in a fog of social obligations that felt more oppressive than ever before. Adrian maintained careful distance, their conversations limited to what was required by courtesy. Other guests noticed the change, whispers following them through the evening like shadows. When the last visitor had departed, Catherine fled to her rooms without the usual polite conversation that had become custom. She dismissed her maid and stood at the window, staring out at Windemere's grounds silvered by moonlight. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Edmund entered at her invitation, his expression serious. "My brother is an idiot," he announced without preamble. "But he's an idiot who loves you, even if he's too terrified to say so plainly." "Love?" Catherine shook her head. "He doesn't trust his own feelings enough to name them that. Because the last time he did, it destroyed him." Edmund moved to stand beside her at the window. "But Catherine, I've known Adrian my entire life. I've seen him with dozens of women society thrust in his path. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, as though you might save him from drowning, if only he can bring himself to reach for the lifeline." "What if I can't save him?" Catherine asked quietly. "What if, despite everything, this is simply a beautiful mistake that will cause us both more pain than if we'd maintained proper distance? Then at least you'll have tried." Edmund turned to face her fully. "Miss Fairmont, Catherine, you deserve better than a man too damaged to properly value you. But you also deserve the chance to discover if that damage can be healed. Don't let him waste this because he's afraid. And don't let your own fear make the decision for you." After he left, Catherine returned to the window and watched the night deepen toward dawn. 2 more nights, 48 hours, and then all the careful structures they had built would either transform into something real or collapse entirely. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and whispered into the darkness, "What happens next?" But no answer came, save the wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl hunting in Windemere's ancient woods. The morning of the 29th day broke bright and deceptively calm, as if the sky itself refused to acknowledge that something in the careful balance of Windemere Hall was about to snap. Catherine woke with that peculiar heaviness that comes at the end of a long performance. 2 nights remained, 2 final evenings to stand at Adrian's side as if the world believed they shared a future, when the only thing truly promised between them was an ending. She dressed in a plain but well-made gown of dove-grey wool and twisted her dark hair into a neat knot, hands moving on habit while her thoughts wandered circles. Tonight would be the last grand ball of the 30 nights. Tomorrow, the contract would be complete. After that, London, uncertainty, and the question of whether Adrian Carlyle would choose to be anything in her life that was not written into a legal agreement. Downstairs, The house was vibrating with preparation. Footmen carried trays of polished glassware. Maids hurried past with linens and arrangements of late autumn foliage. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, roast meats, and fresh flowers. Catherine found Mrs. Winslow in the morning room, directing the placement of tall vases and candelabra, and joined her in arranging branches of copper beech and clusters of deep red berries. They were working in companionable silence when the sound of wheels crunching on gravel cut through the quiet. One carriage, then a second, then a third. Mrs. Winslow frowned. That cannot be deliveries. Everything for tonight arrived yesterday. Moments later, Harrington appeared in the doorway, his sober face marked by an unease Catherine had rarely seen. Mrs. Winslow, Miss Fairmont. He inclined his head. Several gentlemen from the neighbourhood have arrived without prior notice. They insist on seeing His Grace on an urgent matter. At this hour? Mrs. Winslow's mouth thinned. Which gentlemen? Lord Whitmore, Sir Rupert Marsh, Mr. Ellison, and Mr. Carraway, madam. Catherine felt a faint prickle of dread along her spine. Has His Grace received them already? Yes, miss. They are with him in the blue drawing-room. Harrington withdrew. The door had scarcely closed when another figure moved past the archway. Edmund, walking quickly, his usual easy grace tightened into something sharper. Catherine stepped away from the flowers. Mr. Carlyle. He stopped, glanced at Mrs. Winslow, then stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. Something's wrong, Catherine said quietly. That would be one way to describe it, Edmund answered. The humour that usually threaded his voice was completely absent. I came to you before the house begins feigning that everything is perfectly ordinary. Then tell me plainly, she said. What has happened? Edmund's gaze softened in something like apology. A letter has been circulating since last night. It appears to be written by you to a supposed friend in London. In it, you describe your time here as a calculated scheme to manipulate Adrian and extract more money from him than the £3,000 originally agreed. Her hand tightened on the stem of a branch until a few brittle leaves snapped. A scheme, she repeated. It paints you as amused by his supposed blindness, very clear that the agreed sum is only the beginning, and quite confident that he will pay handsomely to avoid scandal. Edmund's jaw clenched. It is vicious and clever, and I do not believe a single word of it. May I hear the worst of it? She asked, because she knew that if she was to face what came next, she needed to understand what had been put into the world under her name. He drew a breath. You boast that poverty has taught you to seize opportunity, that the Duke's fear of public embarrassment makes him easy to control, and that once he falls properly in love, you intend to demand a settlement or further payments beyond the £3,000 he believes sufficient. For a moment, the room blurred at the edges. Catherine forced her focus back with effort. And the letter bears my signature. A tolerable imitation of your hand, Edmund said. Tolerable, not flawless, but close enough to deceive men who already fear seeing Adrian humiliated a second time. Who has seen it? Whitmore, Marsh, Ellison, Carraway, Edmund answered. Enough to stir up a quorum of righteous concern. They have brought it here under the guise of protecting my brother. Catherine let out a slow breath. Philippa. A grim light entered Edmund's eyes. It has her stench all over it. I sent word to a contact in London days ago to ask about a certain forger. This morning I received confirmation that Marcus Whitaker, a man with more ink on his conscience than in his inkwell, was commissioned last week to produce a letter in a lady's hand. The timing matches too neatly to be coincidence. I am pressing for a signed statement, but it has not arrived yet. So, for now, Catherine said, there is only a piece of paper and the question of whether your brother believes it. More accurately, Edmund replied, the question of whether he believes you. She met his gaze steadily. Then I would rather be present for the answer than wait to hear it second-hand. Are you certain? Edmund asked. You have every right to refuse to stand trial in your own drawing-room. I will not allow my name to be passed around like gossip while I hide upstairs, she said. If my honour is in question, I will look everyone in the eye when they doubt me. He studied her for a heartbeat, then gave a short, grim nod. Then let us go and watch fools prove themselves. The blue drawing room was heavy with unshed judgment when they entered. Lord Whitmore stood with his back to the hearth, shoulders squared in the posture of a man convinced of his own importance. Sir Rupert's ruddy face was creased with awkward concern. Ellison and Carraway looked like men who enjoyed being close to drama while pretending to deplore it. Adrian stood opposite them, spine straight, hands clasped behind his back. The familiar armour of the Duke of Windemere was firmly in place, but Catherine saw how tightly his jaw was set, how strained the skin around his eyes appeared. On a small side table between them lay a folded sheet of cream paper. Harrington announced her. Every head turned. "Miss Fairmont," Lord Whitmore began with ponderous gravity. "I am not certain." "You are discussing a letter in which I am named," Catherine said, before he could finish. "I am certain my presence is appropriate." She walked to the table. The sheet of paper lay there like something poisonous, too small for the damage it had already done. She did not reach for it immediately. "May I see it?" she asked. Adrian picked it up and placed it in her hand. His fingers brushed hers, cool and controlled. His expression when she glanced up was impossible to read. She unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was uncannily similar to her own, the same forward slant, the same careful loops on capitals. To anyone who had seen only a few lines of her script, it would have been convincing. To her, having spent a lifetime watching those same letters form beneath her hand, the small wrongnesses screamed. The words beneath were something else entirely. Each sentence twisted real facts, her poverty, the contract, Adrian's past hurt, into something cruel and calculating. Lines leered up at her about using his desperate need to avoid scandal, about squeezing more coin from an anxious duke, about having no intention of leaving with merely the agreed sum when his heart and purse are ripe for the taking. By the time she reached the closing, her name scrawled with a flourish that mimicked her signature. Her stomach had settled from shock into a hard knot. She refolded the letter along its creases and set it down with deliberate care. "That is not my writing," she said, "and those are not my thoughts." "It is remarkably similar to your hand," Lord Whitmore countered, tone heavy with importance. "And the sentiments, though distasteful, do align with a certain interpretation of recent events." "An interpretation convenient to some," Edmund muttered. "Our only concern," Sir Rupert said, "is His Grace's welfare. He has survived one ghastly deception. We would not stand idle if he were at risk of another." Catherine did not look at them. She turned instead to Adrian. His eyes were on her, blue and strained. She saw everything she had come to know of him in that gaze. The man who shouldered endless duty, the boy who had once trusted the wrong person, the adult who had convinced himself that feeling nothing was safer than feeling anything that might be taken away. "Do you believe I wrote this?" she asked quietly. The question cut through the room like a drawn blade. The gentlemen shifted, suddenly aware that they were no longer the audience, but the witnesses. Adrian opened his mouth. For a heartbeat, Catherine thought she saw his answer in his eyes, saw the denial he wanted to give. Then something moved behind them. Memory, terror, the ghost of Lady Helena with her stolen money and her parting note. He hesitated. "Catherine, He did not finish. The pause was not long. It did not need to be. In that narrow space between her question and his incomplete answer, the truth was laid bare. Doubt existed. He might fight it. He might later defeat it. But it was there. Her decision settled with a strange, painful clarity. "The contract is technically fulfilled with 29 nights," she said, her voice level and clear. "Mr. Greaves explained as much when we reviewed the terms. The testament required that you demonstrate intent to establish a family. You have spent 29 consecutive nights presenting me at your side. The witnesses present here have seen it with their own eyes." Whitmore looked briefly disconcerted. "Miss Fairmont, there is no need for—" "There is every need," she answered, not taking her eyes from Adrian. "I will not remain under a roof where my integrity can be publicly questioned, and my host cannot immediately and unequivocally deny the accusation." Colour rose in Sir Rupert's cheeks. No one wishes to drive you away, Miss Fairmont. Only, you wish to shield his grace from harm, she said. Very well. I relieve you of the burden of my presence. She turned back to Adrian, the man who had offered her salvation in the form of a contract. And then, somewhere along the way, more than either of them had intended, I will not accept the final payment, she said quietly. You may keep the remaining £1,500. I will not have it said that I took so much as an extra shilling once suspicion had been cast upon my motives. He flinched. Catherine, if you later decide to discover who truly commissioned and wrote that letter, she continued, I have no doubt you will succeed. You are a thorough man when you choose to be. But any apology built upon evidence that arrives after the fact has a different weight than trust given when it was needed. Silence pooled thickly in the room. Good day, gentlemen, she said, with a small, perfect inclination of her head that would not have shamed a ballroom in her father's time. I wish you all an agreeable afternoon. She walked out with her spine straight and her steps measured, the way her mother had once instructed her never to turn her back on a room full of observers. On the stairs, she met Mrs. Winslow, who had clearly been hovering within earshot. My dear, the housekeeper murmured, taking in Catherine's face. What has he allowed them to do? He allowed himself to hesitate, Catherine said. That is enough. I will have your trunk packed immediately, Mrs. Winslow replied, eyes flashing through a suspicious sheen of tears. If His Grace objects, he can lodge his complaint with the Almighty, because I certainly will not entertain it. In her room, the act of packing felt frighteningly familiar. The same trunk, the same careful wrapping of the miniature of her parents, the same folding of a small number of gowns that represented all she owned. She had thought never to repeat this particular ritual. Yet here she was, once again fitting her life into a wooden box, because a world ruled by men and money left her with little else to do. She was fastening the clasp on her travelling case when the door opened without a knock. Edmund. He took in the trunk, the cloak laid out on the bed, and let out a low whistle devoid of amusement. So he managed it, Edmund said. He found the one way to prove every warning I've ever given him about his own stubbornness. It wasn't stubbornness, Catherine replied, smoothing a wrinkle from her cloak. It was fear, understandable fear, but no less damaging for that. For the record, Edmund said, I never believed that filthy letter. Nor did Mrs. Winslow. Nor I suspect half the staff. They've been watching you for weeks. They know what you are. That means more than you know, she said quietly. But your brother's doubt is the one that matters. He hesitated, then said, My man in London sent another message. Marcus Whitaker has confessed. He admitted in front of witnesses that Lady Philippa Hartley paid him handsomely to craft a letter in your hand. He is preparing a written statement as we speak, with samples of his script to match. Within days, Adrian will have proof. Catherine's hands did not stop moving as she folded her cloak over her arm. Proof that I spoke the truth from the first moment I saw that paper. Yes, and yet, she said softly, in the moment when proof did not exist, he could not bring himself to believe me. Edmund exhaled. He was blindsided. That cursed letter hit every old wound he has. I know, she answered. I truly do. That is why I cannot hate him for it. But I also cannot stay. I have spent 3 years living in crisis, making decisions with no time and no resources. I will not choose now to live where my worth depends on whether a frightened man wins or loses his private battle with a ghost. You could stay until the confession arrives, Edmund suggested. Force him to face you with the truth in his hands. And in those days, Catherine shook her head. I would walk through these rooms knowing that when I asked if he trusted me, he had no answer. I have too little self-respect left to choose that. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, the resignation in it not entirely devoid of respect. You are, as I may have mentioned, far too good for my brother. She managed a faint smile. You are not obligated to say that. Oh, I am, Edmund said. Otherwise I might be tempted to shake him until his brains rattle. He moved to the door, then paused. If, and I suspect it is when, not if, he comes after you, Do not make it easy. He does not deserve easy. But if you have even the smallest space left in your heart for him, do not vanish so completely he cannot find you. I'll consider it, she said. But that choice will depend on the man who arrives, not the Duke who let me walk away. After he left, she donned her cloak, tied the ribbons of her bonnet, and took one last look around the room that had, for a brief, improbable time, felt like a place she belonged. When she descended to the entrance hall, her trunk was already strapped to the back of a modest hired carriage. Mrs. Winslow waited by the door, back straight, hands folded tightly. "Safe journey, Miss Fairmont," the housekeeper said, voice trembling. "You have brought light to this house. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." "Thank you," Catherine replied, "for your kindness, for treating me as more than just a name on a contract." Harrington bowed more deeply than strict propriety required. Several maids lingered in doorways, pretending to dust or straighten arrangements, their eyes bright. Catherine stepped into the carriage. As the footman closed the door, she could not resist one last look up at the facade of Windemere Hall. He was there. Adrian stood at an upstairs window, one hand braced on the frame, watching. Their eyes met across the distance. Too far for words, too far for apologies, but not too far for recognition. In that silent exchange, Catherine saw remorse, shock, and something that might, in another life, have been hope. The coachman flicked the reins. The carriage lurched forward. The great house began to recede, shrinking with each turn of the wheels until it was only stone and glass against the autumn sky. Some time later, in the library Catherine had grown to love, Edmund tossed a folded document onto Adrian's desk with more force than was necessary. "Marcus Whitaker has confessed," he said. "In writing, witnessed. He names Lady Philippa Hartley as his patron and describes in painful detail how she dictated every poisonous line of that letter." Adrian stared at the document without touching it. The forged letter lay beside it, still bearing the faint creases from Catherine's careful hands. "So it was Philippa," he said quietly. "As anyone with sense already knew," Edmund replied. "Congratulations, you were right about her. Less right about the woman you just let ride away." Adrian's hands closed slowly into fists. "How long ago did she leave?" "Long enough that you won't catch her before London," Edmund said. "Long enough that she's had time to decide exactly how much she can bear to forgive." Adrian drew a slow breath that sounded like it scraped his lungs on the way in. "I doubted her." "Yes," Edmund said, "for a heartbeat, in front of men who were eager to see that doubt. That was all it took. I told myself I had learned from Helena," Adrian murmured, almost to himself, "that I would never again be blind. Instead, I have been something worse, suspicious of the wrong person." "You have been afraid," Edmund corrected, "and you have let that fear rule you. Now you have a choice. Do you let it cost you the only woman who's seen you as more than a title, or do you swallow your pride and go after her?" Adrian looked toward the window, where the drive curved away toward the road to London. The light there was already shifting toward late afternoon. "I have spent 9 years allowing my past to dictate my future," he said slowly. "It seems I've finally found a reason to stop." He reached for both letters, the lie and the confession that unmasked it, and folded them together. "Tobias will be displeased," Edmund observed. "You've not given him nearly enough notice for a trip to town." "He will survive the shock," Adrian said. "He may even enjoy it." He picked up his hat and gloves. "Do you think she'll hear me out?" he asked quietly. Edmund considered. "I think Catherine Fairmont values honesty and growth more than perfection, but she has no tolerance left for half measures. If you go to her, it must be as Adrian, not as the Duke of Windemere seeking to tidy an unfortunate incident. If you can't manage that, stay here." Adrian inclined his head once, accepting the verdict. Then he left the library, the forged letter and its unmasking tucked inside his coat, not as a burden to hide, but as a reminder of what cowardice had cost him and what courage might yet restore. Far down the road, a carriage bearing Catherine Fairmont rolled steadily toward London, carrying with it a woman who had decided she would rather face uncertainty on her own terms than security without trust. Forgiveness was never meant to be easy, It was meant to be chosen with open eyes, knowing exactly what was risked and what might be regained. The London fog clung low over the streets when Adrian Carlyle stepped down from his carriage in Cheapside. The neighbourhood smelled of coal smoke and damp stone. A world away from the clean air and ordered lawns of Windemere. He drew his cloak tighter against the chill and glanced up at the narrow front of the lodging house Edmund had described, its bricks darkened by years of soot and rain. It was a building Catherine had once called home out of necessity, not choice. He had known that in the abstract when he sent the first half of her payment. Standing before it now, Adrian felt the knowledge settle differently. Every cracked stone, every missing pane in the upper windows, every sag in the roofline spoke of the life she had endured before he pulled her, temporarily, into his world. He knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman of compressed middle age. Her hair scraped back beneath a worn cap, her features pinched by years of chasing rent from people who had none to give. "Yes?" she demanded. "Good morning," Adrian said, forcing his voice into something approaching politeness. "I am looking for Miss Catherine Fairmont. I was given this address." Mrs. Dawson's eyes narrowed, travelling from his polished boots to his gloves to the cut of his coat. "And who might you be to her?" Former employer," he said. The word tasted wrong. "My name is Adrian Carlyle." Recognition flickered, then sharpened. "The Duke of Windemere." Adrian's mouth tightened. "Yes." Her chin lifted. "You're too late." A beat of silence. "Too late." "She left yesterday," Mrs. Dawson said briskly, though something like sorrow tugged at the edges of her voice. "Packed her things and paid what she owed, months in advance. Said she'd had enough of damp walls and thin ceilings. Left no forwarding address." Adrian felt the words like a physical blow. "She told you nothing of where she intended to go, only that she meant to find work that did not depend on any man's favour," Mrs. Dawson replied. "Somewhere she could breathe without wondering when the floorboards were going to vanish under her feet." The woman's gaze sharpened. "Whatever you did, Your Grace, it sent her out that door with her head high and her eyes red. I don't know if that speaks better of her pride or your folly." He could not argue with either assessment. "If she should write to you," he said, reaching into his coat for a card, "would you be so kind as to forward any letter to this address and send me word that you have heard from her?" Mrs. Dawson accepted the card, expressions softening marginally. "She may not write," she warned. "She said she was finished looking back." "Nevertheless," Adrian said, "I would be grateful." He returned to his carriage with the heavy knowledge that he had arrived one day too late. Catherine had done exactly what she had promised, walked away, carrying her dignity with her. There was grim comfort in knowing she had paid her debts and left on her own terms. It did nothing to ease the hollowness in his chest. Back in his townhouse near Berkeley Square, Adrian sat with Tobias Greaves and Edmund in the study. The forged letter and Marcus Whitaker's confession spread between them, like the tools of a surgeon facing a ruined limb. "Whitaker's statement is ironclad," Greaves said, tapping the signed page with one ink-stained finger. "Witnessed by two reputable solicitors. The samples of his hand match the letter perfectly. Lady Philippa's name is given without equivocation." "It will be enough to destroy her standing in society," Edmund observed, "even without a formal case. Once word spreads that she hired a known forger to ruin another woman's reputation, she will find that invitations evaporate with remarkable speed." Adrian stared at the confession without truly seeing it. "I don't care what happens to Philippa." Greaves raised an eyebrow. "Your lack of concern for her ladyship's prospects does you credit, but we must consider the question of reputation more broadly. Yours and Miss Fairmont's. Mine is weathered," Adrian said. "It has withstood worse." He closed his hand over the edges of the papers. "Hers is another matter." "You mean to address that publicly?" Edmund guessed. "I do," Adrian replied. "Once we return to Windemere for the final ball. The invitations have been out for weeks. The same people who saw that letter and whispered about it will attend. They will hear the truth from me." Greaves steepled his fingers. "It is an unusual step for a man in your position. Dukes are not generally in the habit of admitting error. Then perhaps it is time one of us broke tradition." Adrian said. I will not allow her name to remain stained because I lacked courage in a single moment. Greaves regarded him for a long moment, something like quiet approval in his gaze. Very well, Your Grace. In that case, the question becomes how best to frame your declaration so that it clears Miss Fairmont entirely and cannot be twisted into further scandal. Adrian let out a breath that felt like it had been caged for 9 years. We begin with the truth, all of it. The journey back to Windemere was both familiar and altered. The same hedgerows, the same red-gold trees, the same long curve of drive lined with beeches, and yet the house that came into view at the end of it looked different to Adrian now, as if Catherine's brief presence had changed the shape of his own home. The final night of the contract arrived crisp and cold. The house glittered with candlelight, the ballroom polished to glass, the orchestra tuned and ready. The guest list read like a compendium of everyone who mattered within 50 miles, and everyone who had seen or heard of the forged letter. But when the guests began to arrive, there was one absence Adrian felt more sharply than any presence. He stood at the foot of the stairs out of habit, his position beside him empty. Every swish of silk on the steps above made his heart kick once in his chest, before settling when it was not her. Edmund watched from near the ballroom doors, his expression shuttered. Are you certain you wish to do this? Edmund asked quietly, when there was a brief lull between arrivals. There is still time to invent an illness and send everyone away. I have spent too much of my life hiding behind propriety, Adrian replied. I will not do so now. When at last the ballroom was full, the chandeliers blazing and the music flowing, Adrian stepped into the center of the room and raised one hand. The orchestra faltered, then fell silent. Conversation died away in ripples, curiosity sharpening the air. Your Grace, Lord Whitmore called from near the punch bowl. Is there some announcement we were not informed of? Adrian inclined his head slightly. There is. I ask your patience for a few moments. He looked out over the sea of faces. Many were familiar. Some were friendly. Others watched him with poorly concealed anticipation, waiting to see the next installment of the Duke of Windemere's private tragedies. He let them look. It was time they truly saw. Several days ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. A letter was circulated among some of you. It purported to be from Miss Catherine Fairmont, who was recently my guest at Windemere Hall. In it, she was said to boast of manipulating me for financial gain. A murmur rose, quickly suppressed. It has since been proven, beyond any doubt, that this letter was a forgery, Adrian continued. The man who wrote it, Marcus Whitaker, has confessed and provided samples of his hand that match the document. He has also named the person who commissioned it, Lady Philippa Hartley. Every head turned. Lady Philippa, seated near the edge of the room, went white. This confession is in writing, Adrian said. It is witnessed by reputable members of the legal profession and will be made available to anyone who wishes to see it. Allow me to be perfectly clear. Miss Fairmont wrote no such letter. She never spoke in my hearing, or in anyone's, as far as I am aware, of any intention to seek more from me than the precise terms of our agreement. He let that sink in, feeling the weight of every eye on him. His next words were harder because they cost him more. In fact, he went on, it was I who failed her. The silence grew absolute. Miss Fairmont has endured more hardship in the last 3 years than most of us in this room can imagine, Adrian said. Despite that, she has conducted herself with dignity, intelligence, and honor. When confronted with an accusation that should have been laughable, I allowed old wounds and past betrayals to steel my tongue at the very moment she asked me a simple question. He swallowed once. She said, "Do you believe I wrote this?" I did not answer quickly enough. That failure in her eyes was answer enough. A rustle moved through the crowd. Surprise in some quarters, discomfort in others. She chose, quite rightly, not to remain where her integrity was not met with immediate and unquestioning faith, Adrian said. She returned to London before the completion of our 30 nights, satisfied that the terms of the testament had been met. She refused the final half of the payment owed to her, despite my insistence that she accept it. He paused and looked out over the assembled faces, seeking out Lord Whitmore, Sir Rupert, the others who had stood in his drawing room while Catherine's honour was dissected. Some of you were present when that forged letter was first produced, he said. You saw my hesitation. You saw her dignity as she chose to leave rather than plead. I tell you now, I was wrong. You were wrong if you allowed that brief moment to colour your judgment of her. Whatever you may have heard whispered since, you will not repeat it in my hearing and remain welcome at Windemere. Colour flooded Lord Whitmore's cheeks. He looked elsewhere. As for Lady Philippa, Adrian continued, turning his gaze on her, she will find that our doors are closed to her from this night forward. I will not press charges, though I would be well within my rights to do so. Her punishment, such as it is, will be to live in a world that knows exactly what she was willing to do to another woman to satisfy her own desperation. Philippa's lips trembled. Tears gathered in her eyes, not of remorse, but of fury and humiliation. She rose unsteadily and strode from the ballroom, whispers trailing behind her like a torn train. Adrian let her go. He drew a breath and forced himself to the last, hardest piece. I do not know how many of you truly care about the distinction between gossip and truth where Miss Fairmont is concerned, he said. Society often prefers the former, but on the chance that there are still a few who value a woman's reputation as much as a man's pride, you will hear this from me. Catherine Fairmont is the best person I have met in a very long time. She came into my life by way of a contract, yes. She left it by way of a choice, mine and hers. He let his hand fall. The orchestra may resume, he finished. Anyone who takes pleasure in further discussing Miss Fairmont's supposed conduct will do so elsewhere. I have no more tolerance for it. The conductor hesitated, then lifted his baton. Music resumed, hesitant at first, then steadier as conversations slowly returned. The shape of the evening had shifted permanently, but the surface of propriety, with its endless capacity for self-healing, began to reassert itself. Edmund moved to his brother's side, a glass in hand. Well, he said, if nothing else, grandmother would be pleased. You finally did something scandalous for the right reasons. It was the least I owed her, Adrian replied. It was not the least, Edmund said. But it was a beginning. The ball continued, but for the first time since his coming of age, Adrian moved through it as though he were only half there. He danced when required, spoke when spoken to, smiled when politeness demanded it. All the while, one thought beat beneath his ribs with the stubborn rhythm of a remembered song. Catherine is not here. Later, in the quiet of his study, he took out the forged letter and Whitaker's confession. Side by side, they looked like a parable. The lie and its unmasking. The cost of fear and the demand for courage. He picked up a pen and pulled a sheet of his own paper closer. Miss Fairmont, this letter will no doubt join many others you have received, some kinder than others. I do not presume that you will welcome it. I write not because I deserve your attention, but because I cannot allow my last words to you to remain the ones spoken in that room. I was wrong. The simplicity of the admission steadied him. He continued, You asked me a simple question. Do you believe I wrote this? The answer, if I had been the man I wished to be, would have been immediate and unequivocal. Instead, I allowed the memory of another woman's betrayal to steal that answer from me. In doing so, I wronged you. Marcus Whitaker has confessed. Lady Philippa has been revealed as the architect of the lie. The world will, in time, speak of these things as though they matter most. They do not. What matters is that before I had any proof beyond what I knew of your character, I failed to give you the trust you had earned 100 times over. You told me once that the world had taken almost everything from you except your dignity. When you walked out of the blue drawing room, you carried that dignity with you. I do not seek to diminish it now with pleas or excuses. However, I would be a coward twice over if I did not also speak another truth. I miss you, not the convenience of your presence, not the ease with which you managed my guests, not the way your existence solved the problem of a clause in a will. I miss you. Your mind, your humour, your stubborn refusal to accept anything less than honesty. If you wish never to see me again, I will accept that decision. You owe me nothing. If, however, there is any part of you that wonders whether the man who failed you in that moment might yet become someone worthy of your regard, I ask for the chance to prove it. Not with contracts, not with payments, not with arrangements made in offices and signed in ink, but with time, with persistence, with the sort of patience I should have shown you from the beginning. If you are willing, send me a line to let me know where I may call. If you are not, burn this letter and think no more of it. I will not pursue you without consent. Whatever your choice, know this. Your name has been cleared in every place where mine has any authority. The stain placed upon you was never yours to bear. Adrian Carlyle. He sanded the letter, folded it, and sealed it with his signet. In the morning, he sent it not to Cheapside, where he knew she no longer was, but to Tobias Greaves, with instructions to forward it to any direction Catherine might later provide. It was, he knew, a fragile line cast into uncertain waters. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. Snow dusted the gardens at Windemere, softening sharp edges, covering the scars of fallen leaves. The scandal over Philippa's machinations ran its course with the usual veracity and short memory of society. Invitations stopped coming to her door. She retreated to some lesser relative's estate, where her name grew cold on people's tongues. Adrian went about his duties. He met with tenants, corresponded with Parliament, oversaw repairs. He rode out in the mornings and returned more restless than before. At night, he found himself, more often than not, in the library where Catherine had once sat in the window seat, feet tucked beneath her, a book open in her hands. One evening, as he stood staring at the shelves without seeing the titles, Edmund entered with a letter in his hand. "This arrived from Greaves," he said, offering it. Adrian took it. The handwriting on the outer fold was Tobias's, neat and compact. Inside, a single sheet in a more familiar hand, precise, feminine, with the small flourishes he could now distinguish easily from Whitaker's forgery. "Adrian, Mr. Greaves forwarded your letter to me some days ago. I have read it more than once. You said you did not write to ask forgiveness. I appreciate that. You acknowledged what you did and did not try to hide behind your history. That, more than any eloquent apology, compelled me to answer. I do not pretend that a confession in a forger's hand changes what I felt in that room. It does not erase the moment when I realized that your fear still held more power over you than your knowledge of my character. That understanding will always be a part of what we are to each other, but it is not the only part. You also told the truth publicly when you had nothing to gain from doing so except the easing of your conscience and the restoration of my name. You chose to speak in a room full of people who prefer their scandals tidy and their dukes infallible. That cannot have been easy. I will not pretend it means nothing. You ask whether the man who failed me might yet become someone worthy of my regard. The answer is not something I can give in a single line on a page. It is something that can only be discovered over time. If you still wish to attempt that discovery, you may call at the following address on any afternoon you find yourself in London, Mrs. Pembroke's boarding house for ladies, Bloomsbury. I must warn you that the drawing room there is small, the tea is mediocre, and the company will likely include at least one widow who does not believe men should be permitted indoors at all. It is, however, a place that is mine by choice, not necessity. That distinction matters to me. If you come not as the Duke seeking to correct an unfortunate incident, but as Adrian, who once spoke in a storm-lit dining room of a life he might have wanted and the walls he did not know how to dismantle. If you do not come, I shall conclude that your letter was written in a moment of remorse and leave it at that. My life will continue. I have, at last, relearned how to build one. Catherine Fairmont P.S. Do not bring contracts, or a bank draft, or, God forbid, a new proposal involving a set number of afternoons. A sound escaped Adrian that was half laugh, half choked breath. Edmund, watching his face, smiled slowly. "Well?" he asked. "Is that a rope or a noose?" "A door," Adrian said, folding the letter carefully. "She has opened a door. The question is whether I have the courage to walk through it. Then buy a decent London hat, Edmund replied. You're going to Bloomsbury. Time did not stop for their feelings. It moved, as it always did, in its steady way. The world turned from winter towards spring. Somewhere in Bloomsbury, a narrow house filled with books and stubborn women added one more thread to Catherine Fairmont's new life. Students to tutor, a small group of ladies who wanted to learn French, a widow who needed help with correspondence. On a clear afternoon, the bell at Mrs. Pembroke's boarding house rang. Catherine, seated at a small table with a pile of papers and a pot of indifferent tea, heard the murmur of voices in the hall, the landlady's sharp, brisk tones, and beneath them a deeper one that made her pulse skip in a way she had told herself she no longer allowed. Mrs. Pembroke entered first, cheeks flushed. Miss Fairmont, there is a gentleman here to see you. I told him we do not generally admit such creatures, but he was annoyingly polite about it. Behind her, Adrian stepped into the modest drawing room, the height and breadth of him making the space seem smaller. He wore a dark coat and a London-appropriate hat, which he held respectfully in his hands. His gaze found Catherine immediately. Miss Fairmont, he said, and the formal address, spoken with deliberate care, felt like a promise rather than a wall. Your Grace, she replied, just as carefully. Then, after a heartbeat, Adrian. He drew a breath, something loosening in his shoulders. Catherine, Mrs. Pembroke sniffed. I shall be in the parlour if you need me. I do not approve of men invading my drawing room, but I will make an exception this once. For research purposes. She withdrew, leaving them in a room that had seen better carpets and more fashionable upholstery, but which carried, unmistakably, the stamp of Catherine's presence. A vase of fresh flowers on the mantel, a neat stack of novels on the table, a shawl folded over the back of a chair. You came, Catherine said. I told you I would try, he answered. For once I thought it best to be a man whose actions match his words. She gestured to the opposite chair. He sat, a fraction more stiffly than he would have in his own drawing room, as if aware that here he was not master of the space. I cannot promise you ease, Catherine said, or that I will not remember, in some sharp moments, that day in the blue drawing room. But I am willing to see who we might be when no contracts bind us and no witnesses watch. Nor can I promise perfection, he replied, only that I will not hide behind my title or my past, that I will allow you to see me fail and try again, rather than retreat into safety. That, she said, sounds suspiciously like the beginning of something real. They regarded each other across the small table. The space between them was not so wide now. It was filled with mistakes acknowledged, truths spoken, and the possibility of a future chosen rather than arranged. Months later, on a spring afternoon at Windemere, the chapel filled quietly with those who mattered most. Edmund stood at Adrian's side, straightening his cravat with unnecessary fuss. Mrs. Winslow dabbed at her eyes in the second pew. Tobias Greaves sat a few rows back, pretending not to be moved. Catherine walked up the short aisle in a gown of cream satin, simple and elegant. There were no 30 nights of conditions, no clauses to satisfy, no witnesses in whose eyes she needed to perform. There was only the man waiting at the altar, looking at her as if, after years of wandering down the corridors of duty, he had finally found his way into the room he was meant to inhabit. Do you take this man? The vicar asked, not as a duke, nor as a contract made flesh, but as the person he has shown himself to be when all the world is stripped away. I do, Catherine said, and this time there was no doubt in either of their minds what those words meant. Years later, under a pale spring sky, Catherine and Adrian stood hand in hand before a modest grave in the small cemetery on Windemere's grounds. A 2-year-old boy tugged at Catherine's skirt, impatient with adult stillness. She scooped him up, settling his weight on her hip. We're visiting great-grandmother, she told him, the woman who wrote something in a will that changed everything. Adrian knelt to place a small bouquet of primroses on the stone. The inscription named the Dowager Duchess, beloved mother and grandmother. It did not mention the clause that had set all this in motion. That story lived elsewhere now, in the house behind them, in the lives intertwining within it. in the quiet knowledge shared between two people who had once met over a contract and ended with a choice. She meant to save me from myself, Adrian said softly, to force me to look beyond fear. Catherine shifted their son on her hip. Perhaps, she said. Or perhaps she knew there was a woman in the world stubborn enough to walk away from a duke if he proved himself a coward. He looked up at her, eyes full of something that had long since outgrown its old boundaries. Either way, he said, rising to take her free hand. She succeeded. They turned back toward the house, toward the messy, imperfect, hard-won life they had chosen together. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere inside, a child laughed. 30 nights had once been the measure of their connection. Now the only measure that mattered was each day they chose, again and again, to stay.